Jane Eyre. Part 1. Life at Gateshead. Chapter 1 The Fight. We couldn't go outside at all on that cold, rainy afternoon. The rain was pouring down, and the wind was blowing hard. I didn't care. I was happy to stay indoors. Trying to take long walks in the winter was terrible. It was supposed to be healthy for our bodies, but I hated coming home in the dark with my feet and hands as cold as ice. And I was always unhappy because Bessie, one of the servants, was always scolding me. I had always known that I was different from my cousins, John, Eliza, and Georgiana Reed. They were prettier and taller than I, and everyone loved them. These 3 children were not very nice to other people or to each other. Usually, they spent their time fighting and crying with each other. However, today, they were with their mother in the sitting room, sitting quietly and talking in front of the warm fire. I wanted to join them, but Mrs. Reed, my aunt, said I could not. She was angry with me because Bessie had told her I was being troublesome. "No, I'm sorry, Jane," she said, looking at me as if I was a rat on the floor. "Until I know that you are really trying to be good and quiet, I will not treat you like one of my children. They are good." "What did Bessie tell you? What have I done?" I asked. "Jane Eyre, do not ask me any more questions. You must do what you are told. If you cannot speak nicely and obey me, then be quiet." After she left me, I went into the little room next door. I got a picture book from the shelf and climbed onto the window seat, closing the curtains around me. Now, no one could find me. I stared out the window at the cold, gray November day. The rain fell hard on the garden, which had no leaves or flowers. Then I looked at the picture book. I was inside a world of imagination. For a while, I forgot my sad, lonely life and felt a little happier. I was only afraid that the Reed children might find me. Because they were cruel to me, I tried to talk to them as little as I could. Suddenly, the door opened. John Reed ran in.
"Where are you, you little rat?"
he said. He did not see my hiding place.
"Eliza, Georgie, Jane is not here. Tell Mama she's gone outside. What a bad girl she is."
How lucky I drew the curtain, I thought. I knew he would never find me because he was very stupid. But his sister Eliza was not stupid, and she knew exactly where I was. "She's in the window seat, John," she said. Immediately I came out because I did not want them to be angry with me. "What do you want?" I asked him.
"Say, what would you like, Mr. Reed?"
he said, sitting in a comfortable chair.
"I want you to come here."
John Reed was 14, and I was only 10. He was large, ugly, and fat. He often ate too much at meals, which made him look like a pig. Usually, he was away at school, but his mother had made him come home for a while because she thought his health was not good. He did not have anything to do but fight with his sisters, get into trouble with Bessie, and treat me badly. John did not love his mother or his sisters, and he hated me. He was always cruel to me. Sometimes he hit me, and sometimes he just threatened me. But I was always afraid when he was near. I did not know how to make him treat me well. The servants did not want to make him angry, so they did whatever he wanted. Mrs. Reed, his mother, loved him too much and thought he never did anything wrong. While I walked over to John, I thought about how ugly he was. I think he knew what I was thinking, because he suddenly hit me hard on the face.
"That is for your rudeness to Mama just now,"
he said.
"And for hiding, and for looking at me like that. You dirty little rat."
I was too afraid of John to hit him back.
"Now, what were you doing behind that curtain?"
he asked. "I was reading," I answered softly.
"Give me the book."
I gave it to him.
"You can't touch these books,"
he said.
"You have no money, because your father gave you nothing when he died. You're nothing but a poor street rat. You ought to beg in the city, not live here with a gentleman's family. Anyway, all these books are mine, and so is the whole house. I'll teach you not to touch my things again."
Before I could run away, he lifted the heavy book and threw it hard at me. It hit me and I fell, cutting my head on the door. I was in great pain, and suddenly, for the first time in my life, I was so angry that I forgot my fear of John Reed. "You awful cruel boy!" I shouted at him. "Why did you hit me? I haven't done anything to you. You don't even read those books anyway. You are nothing but a stupid pig. You are as bad as a murderer."
"What? What?"
he screamed.
"How dare you say these things to me? Do you hear this, sisters? I'll tell Mama, but first—"
He ran to attack me, but now he was fighting with an angry girl. In those moments, I really thought he was as bad as a murderer. I felt the blood running down my face, and the pain gave me strength. I fought him as hard as I could, kicking and biting. My strength surprised him, and he shouted for help. His sisters ran and told their mother. She called Bessie and Miss Abbott, her maid. They pulled us apart, and I heard them say, "What a wild little animal! She attacked Master John." Mrs. Reed said calmly, "Take her away to the red room and lock her in there." And so they took me upstairs. As soon as we arrived in the red room, I became quiet again. I knew that it was a mistake to fight John. The servants looked at me angrily. "Really, Miss Eyre," said Bessie, "how could you hit him? He's your young master." "Why is he my master? I am not a servant," I cried. "No, Miss Eyre, you are not a servant, but you are less than one, because you do not work here," said Miss Abbott. They looked at me firmly. "You must remember, Miss Jane," said Bessie, "your aunt pays for your food and clothes, and you should be grateful to her. You have no other family." All my life people had told me this, and I could say nothing. I stayed quiet, listening to these painful words. "And if you are angry and rude, Mrs. Reed may send you away," said Bessie. Miss Abbott said, "God will punish you, Jane Eyre, if you're not careful. Pray to God, and say you're sorry." They left the room and locked the door behind them. The red room was a cold, silent room. It was the largest bedroom in the house, but no one slept in it. 9 years ago, my uncle, Mr. Reed, had died in this room. Since then, no one wanted to go into the room. Now that I was alone, I thought about the terrible people I lived with. John Reed, his sisters, his mother, the servants, They all scolded and hated me. Why could I never please them? Eliza was selfish, but it did not matter. Georgiana had a bad temper, but everyone loved her because she was beautiful. John was ugly, cruel, and violent, but nobody punished him. I tried to be good and make no mistakes, but they called me bad every day. Now that I had fought John to protect myself, everyone blamed me. I spent the rest of the day in the red room, asking myself why I had to suffer and why life was so unfair. Perhaps I should run away or starve myself to death, I thought sadly. Soon it was dark outside. It was raining, and I could hear the wind in the trees. It sounded like ghosts crying. I was no longer angry, and I began to think the Reeds might be right. Perhaps I was really bad inside. Did I deserve to die like my Uncle Reed? I did not remember him. Just before he died, he had made my Aunt Reed promise to care for me like their own children. Now, she probably wished she had never made that promise to him. As I sat there in the dark, I began to think strange things. If Mr. Reed had lived, maybe he would have been nice to me. As I looked around the dark, quiet room, I was afraid that Mr. Reed's ghost might come back. What if he was angry with his wife for treating me badly? He might rise from his grave and appear in this room. I was so scared by this thought that I could not breathe. Suddenly, I saw a light moving on the ceiling. It was probably from a lamp outside, but I was so afraid that I did not think clearly. I thought it must be a ghost, an angry ghost from the land of the dead. My heart beat fast. Was that something moving near me? Screaming loudly, I ran to the door and hit it with my fists. I wanted to break it open and run far away from that cold, dark room. Soon, Miss Abbott and Bessie came running to open it. "Miss Eyre, what is wrong? Are you ill?" asked Bessie. "Please, please, let me leave this room," I screamed. "Why, what happened?" she asked. "I saw a strange light in the room. I know it was a ghost," I cried, holding tightly on to Bessie. "There's nothing wrong with her," said Miss Abbott. "She screamed just to make us come. I know all her little tricks." I heard footsteps in the hall. "What is all that noise?" said an angry voice. Mrs. Reed came in. "Abbott and Bessie, I told you to leave Jane Eyre in this room until I said she could leave." "She screamed so loudly, Mrs. Reed," said Bessie softly. "Let go of her, Bessie," Mrs. Reed said. "Jane Eyre, you will not leave this room until I say you can. Your tricks don't work with me. Now, you will stay here 1 hour more." "Oh, Aunt, forgive me. I shall die if you keep me here," I screamed and kicked as she held me. "Be quiet." She pushed me back into the red room and locked the door. There I was in the darkness again, with the ghosts and the silence. I screamed until I must have fainted, because I do not remember anything more. Chapter 2. Going to School. When I woke up, a doctor was carrying me to my own bedroom. It was good to be back in my room, which had a warm fire and candlelight. I was also happy to see Dr. Lloyd, who was a very kind man. He was the doctor that helped the servants at Gateshead. He was taking care of me so kindly that I felt he would protect me from Mrs. Reed. He talked to me a little and then told Bessie to take good care of me. When he left, I began to worry about what would happen. But I was surprised to find that Bessie did not scold me at all. In fact, she was so kind to me that I asked her a question. "Bessie, what's happened? Am I ill?" "Yes, you became ill in the red room because you were screaming so much and were so scared. But don't worry, you'll be all right, Miss Jane," she said. Then she went next door to talk to another servant. I heard what she said. "Sarah, come here and sleep with that poor child and me tonight. I can't stay alone with her. She was so ill last night. Do you think she saw a ghost? Mrs. Reed was too hard on her, I think." So the two servants slept in my room. I did not sleep all night because I was imagining ghosts walking around the room and trying to grab me. Fortunately, I was not very ill, but for the next few days I was extremely scared and sad because of my terrible experience. I cried all day long, and I could not eat or read my favorite books, although Bessie was so kind to me. I was so sad because I knew I had no one to love me and nothing to look forward to. When the doctor came again, he was surprised to see me looking so miserable. "Perhaps she's crying because she could not go out with Mrs. Reed this morning," suggested Bessie.
"I think Miss Jane is smarter than that,"
said the doctor, smiling at me. He looked as if he knew how I felt about the Reed family.
"She is a big girl now."
"I'm not crying about that. I don't like going anywhere with them," I said. "I'm crying because I'm miserable." "Oh, really, Miss Jane?" said Bessie. The doctor looked at me for a few moments. He had gray-colored, intelligent eyes. Just then a bell rang. It was time for the servants to eat their dinner.
"You can go, Bessie,"
he said.
"I'll talk to Miss Jane until you come back."
After Bessie had left, he asked,
"What really made you sick, Jane?"
"I was locked in a room with a ghost in the dark."
"Afraid of ghosts, are you?"
He smiled. "I'm afraid of Mr. Reed's ghost. He died in that room, you know. Nobody ever goes in there any more. It was cruel to lock me in there alone, without a candle. I shall never forget it."
"But you're not afraid now. There is something else that is making you sad, isn't there?"
he said, looking kindly at me. How could I tell him how unhappy my life was? "I have no father or mother, brothers or sisters," I said.
"But you have a kind aunt and cousins."
"No, they are not kind. John Reed hit me, and when I tried to protect myself, my aunt locked me in the red room," I cried.
"Don't you like living in such a beautiful house?"
he asked. "I would be happy to leave it, but I have nowhere to go."
"You have no other family?"
"I think I may have some, who are very poor, but I know nothing about them," I answered. The doctor thought for a while.
"Jane, would you like to go to school?"
he asked finally. I thought for a moment. I had never been to a real school, but at least it would be a new life. "Yes, I would like to go," I said.
"Well, well,"
the doctor said to me.
"I will see what I can do for you, Jane."
Later, the servants told me that the doctor had spoken to Mrs. Reed about me. Mrs. Reed had agreed that I should go away to school. Mrs. Reed's servant, Mrs. Abbott, said Mrs. Reed would be happy to send me away. She told me that my father had been a poor man. He married my uncle's sister, Miss Jane Reed of Gateshead. She was my mother. The Reed family was so angry that they never spoke to my mother again. Sadly, only a year after their wedding, both my parents died of a sickness and left me alone when I was only a baby. But many weeks passed, and Mrs. Reed did not send me away to school. One day when she was scolding me, I asked her a brave question. "Aunt, what would Uncle Reed say to you if he were alive?" I asked. "What did you say to me?" cried Mrs. Reed. Her small, cold gray eyes were afraid. She stared at me as if I knew something she did not know. "My Uncle Reed is now in heaven, and he knows everything you think and do. So do my parents. They know how you are cruel to me and how you hate me." Mrs. Reed slapped my face and left me without saying anything. Bessie scolded me and said I was the worst child in the country for saying such things. Truly, with so much hate in my heart, I did feel terrible. Christmas came, but I received no gifts or new clothes. Every evening I watched Eliza and Georgiana putting on their new dresses and going out to parties. Sometimes Bessie would visit me in my bedroom. She would bring me a piece of cake or tell me a story. When she was kind to me, I thought she was the best person in the world. Unfortunately, she did not always have time for me. One morning in the middle of January, Bessie told me a visitor wanted to see me. Who could it be? When I entered the breakfast room, I saw a tall, thin man dressed all in black. He had a cold face like a stone. "This is the little girl I wrote to you about," said Mrs. Reed to the stranger.
"Well, Jane Eyre,"
said the stranger,
"are you a good child?"
It was impossible to say yes, with Mrs. Reed sitting there, so I was silent. "No, she is a terrible child, Mr. Brocklehurst," said Mrs. Reed, shaking her head.
"I'm sorry to hear that,"
he answered.
"Come here, Jane Eyre, and answer my questions. Where do bad people go after death?"
"They go to hell," I answered.
"And how will you keep away from hell?"
he asked. "I must keep in good health and not die," I said after a moment.
"Wrong. Another question. Do you enjoy reading the Bible?"
"Yes, sometimes," I said slowly.
"That is not enough. Your answers show me that you have a wicked heart. You must pray to God if you ever want to go to heaven."
"Mr. Brocklehurst," said Mrs. Reed,
"I told you in my letter that this little girl is very bad inside.
if you accept her at Lowood School, please make sure that the teachers know how bad she is. She will try to lie to them, of course. You see, Jane, you cannot try your tricks on Mr. Brocklehurst." I tried to please Mrs. Reed, but she always believed I was bad, when it was her children who were the terrible ones. She always thought the worst of me. It was not surprising that I hated her. Now she was going to ruin my chances of a new life at school by making Mr. Brocklehurst think I was wicked.
"Do not worry, Mrs. Reed,"
Mr. Brocklehurst said.
"The teachers will watch her carefully. Life at Lowood will be good for her. We believe that students should have hard work, plain food, simple clothes, and no fun of any kind."
I will send her as soon as possible. I hope she will learn about her low position in life.
"Indeed, she will, Mrs. Reed. I hope she is grateful for everything you are doing for her. Little girl, read this book. It tells the story of the sudden death of a young girl who was a liar. Read and pray to God."
After Mr. Brocklehurst had left, I felt I had to speak. I was too angry to hide my feelings. I walked up to Mrs. Reed and looked her straight in the eye. "Mrs. Reed, I do not lie to people. If I was a liar, I would say I loved you, but I don't. I hate you. I will never call you aunt again as long as I live. If anyone asks how you treated me, I will tell them the truth, that you were cruel to me. You never gave me a chance to show you that I am a good girl. People think you are a good woman, but you are lying to them. At last I had said what I really felt. It made me feel much better, even though I did not know what Mrs. Reed would do to me. But I saw that she looked frightened and unhappy. Jane, I want to be your friend. You don't know what you are saying. You are too excited and angry. Go to your room and lie down. No, Mrs. Reed, I don't need to lie down. I'm very calm. Send me to school soon, Mrs. Reed. Then we will both be happier. I hate living here. I will indeed send her soon, Mrs. Reed said to herself. Part 2. The Schoolgirl. Chapter 3. My First Impressions of School. Finally, in the middle of January, I left Gateshead for Lowood School. Bessie helped me to get ready, even though I had to get up very early to leave. Will you say goodbye to Mrs. Reed, Jane? Bessie asked. No, she doesn't want to wake up. Anyway, I don't want to say anything to her, or the Reed children. They've always hated me. Oh, Miss Jane, don't say that. Well, it's true. Goodbye to Gateshead, I shouted happily, as we left the house and walked towards the road to wait for the coach. Soon it arrived. It was full of people. The driver took all of my clothes and things and told me to get in quickly. Bessie kissed me for the last time as I held tightly to her. She told the driver, "Make sure you take care of her. 50 miles is a long way for a young child to travel when she is alone."
I will,
he answered. The door was closed and the coach rolled off. It felt strange to be leaving Gateshead. Even though I hated life there, it had been my home for as long as I could remember. I was sad to leave Bessie, but I was excited about the new school and the new people I would meet there. The journey was much too long and not very interesting. I did not have any books to read, so I looked out of the window, thinking about my new life. Then I slept for a short time. When I woke up, the coach had stopped. The door opened and a servant called in. "Is there a little girl called Jane Eyre here?" "Yes," I said. The servant helped me out of the coach and took my bags. We went into a large building, and the servant left me in a sitting room. I was very tired after the long journey, so I sat in one of the comfortable chairs. In a few moments, the door opened and a tall lady came into the room. She was pretty, with dark hair and dark eyes. The lady told me that she was Miss Temple, the headmistress of Lowood School. She looked at me carefully. "You are very young to travel alone. Are you tired?" she asked, putting her hand on my shoulder kindly. "Yes, Miss Temple, I am a little tired," I said. "How old are you, and what is your name?" "I'm Jane Eyre, ma'am, and I'm 10 years old." "Well, Jane, I hope you will be a good child and work hard," she said, touching my cheek gently with her finger. Another teacher, named Miss Miller, took me to the schoolroom. In this large room, there were about 80 girls who sat doing their homework. The oldest girl looked about 20 years old. I sat on a bench near the door and watched them quietly. After the homework was done, we each had a small piece of bread for supper. Then we all went upstairs to the long, crowded bedroom, where 2 children shared every bed. I had to share Miss Miller's, but I was so tired that I fell asleep immediately. In the early morning, someone rang a bell to wake us up, although it was still dark outside. I got dressed quickly in the cold room and washed when I could. There was only one bowl of water for 6 girls. When the bell rang again, we all went downstairs to the cold, dark schoolroom for prayers. When the bell rang a 3rd time, it was time to begin our lessons. Everyone moved into 4 groups around 4 tables, and the teachers came into the room to start the Bible class. I was in the class for the youngest girls. I was so glad when it was time for breakfast. I had eaten only a little food the day before, but on that morning, the only food we got was burned porridge. It was so awful that we could not eat it, so we left the dining room with empty stomachs. After breakfast came a happy time of day, when the students could play and talk together a little. Everyone agreed that the breakfast was terrible. At 9 o'clock, the lessons started again and finished at 12. After the lessons, Miss Temple stood up to speak to the whole school. Girls, this morning you had a breakfast which you could not eat. You must be hungry, so I have asked for a lunch of bread and cheese for all of you. The teachers looked at her in surprise. Don't worry, I'll take responsibility for it, she said to them. We were very happy and ran out into the garden to eat our lunch. None of the other girls had spoken to me yet, but I did not mind. I stood alone outside, eating my bread and cheese and trying to forget how cold it was. I thought about my new life. Gateshead was far away, and I did not yet have friends at school. What sort of future would I have? As I thought about these things, I watched a girl near me reading a book. Soon I felt brave enough to speak to her, because I, too, liked reading. Is your book interesting? I asked. Well, I like it, she said. Would you like to look at it? The book was too difficult for me to understand, so I gave it back. What sort of a school is this? I asked. Lowood School is a school for girls whose parents have died. We are all charity children here. Do we have to pay anything to live here? I asked. Our relatives pay £15 a year for each of us. Some kind ladies and gentlemen in London pay the rest of the money. Who is Mr. Brocklehurst? I asked her. His mother built the school, and he is the manager. He lives in a large house near here. I did not see the girl again until the afternoon, when I saw that she was being punished in the schoolroom. I did not know what she had done wrong. The girl did not look upset, though. She was standing in the corner of the room and did not seem to know that everyone was staring at her. If that happened to me, I thought, I would be so embarrassed. After our lessons, we had a small cup of coffee and a piece of brown bread, then half an hour's play, then homework. Finally, after the evening biscuit and drink of water, we said our prayers and went to bed. My first day at Lowood had ended. Chapter 4 My New Friend. The next morning, we got up in the dark. In all the rooms, it was as cold as ice. This time, the porridge was not burned, but I still felt hungry because there was not enough. The girl I had spoken with yesterday was older than me, so she was in a higher class. Her name was Helen Burns. Her history teacher, Miss Scatcherd, seemed to think Helen did everything wrong. She always spoke to Helen in this way. Burns, hold your head up, can't you? Burns, don't stand like that. I thought that Miss Scatcherd's history questions seemed very hard. However, Helen always knew all the answers. She was so smart that I did not understand why the teacher did not like her. That day, she looked at Helen and suddenly said, "You dirty girl! You didn't wash your hands this morning." I was surprised that Helen did not tell her that we could not wash ourselves because the water had been frozen. Miss Scatcherd said something to Helen that I could not hear. Then Helen left the room and returned, carrying a stick. The teacher took it and hit Helen several times with it. I was horrified, but the girl did not cry or change her expression. "Wicked girl," said Miss Scatcherd. "Nothing will change your dirty habits." During the play hour, I found Helen alone, reading the same book as before, and I started talking to her. "Do you want to leave Lowood?" I asked her. "No, I don't. I was sent to school here, so I must learn as much as I can." I was very surprised. "But Miss Scatcherd is so cruel to you," I cried. "She's not cruel. She is strict, and she knows my faults," Helen said. I said angrily, "Why, if she hit me with a stick, I'd grab it and break it under her nose." "I don't think you would," answered Helen quietly. "And if you did, Mr. Brocklehurst would send you away, and your relations would be angry. Anyway, the Bible tells us to do good things even when others hurt us. Life can be hard, but we must try." I could not understand Helen's ideas, but I had a feeling she was right. I looked at her in amazement. "You say you have faults, Helen. What are they? To me, you seem very good." "You are wrong," she answered. "I am careless, and I forget the rules of the school. I read when I should be doing my homework. So, Miss Scatcherd is right to scold me." "Is Miss Temple as strict as that?" I asked. A soft smile passed over Helen's normally serious face. "Miss Temple is very kind. She is full of goodness. She gently tells me my mistakes and is always happy when I do well. But even when she helps me, I am always dreaming and thinking about other things. Then I can't answer the teacher's questions." "But today in history class, you knew all the answers," I said. "I thought it was an interesting subject, that's all," she replied. "You must think Miss Temple's lessons are interesting because you like her and she is good to you. I'm like that. I love those who love me, and I hate those who punish me unfairly. You should read the Bible, Jane. People who believe in Jesus Christ should love their enemies," said Helen. "Then I would love the Reed family, which is impossible," I cried. Helen listened carefully to the long story of my life at Gateshead. "Well," I asked at the end, "Mrs. Reed is a bad woman, isn't she? Don't you agree with me?" "It's true she is unkind, but only because she dislikes your faults. Look how angrily you remember every word. You would be happier if you tried to forget her scolding. Life is too short to hate other people, Jane. We all have faults, but when we die, only the pure flame of the spirit will be left. That's why I never think of revenge. I never consider life unfair. I live in calm, looking forward to the end." For a moment, we both stayed silent. Then one of the big girls came up, calling, "Helen Burns, you go and put away your work immediately, or I'll tell Miss Scatcherd." Helen sighed, but stood up and silently obeyed her. Chapter 5 Mr. Brocklehurst's Visit. It was hard to get used to the rules at Lowood and to the extremely cold, hard winter. In January, February, and March, there was deep snow, but we still had to go outside for 1 hour every day. We had no warm boots or gloves, and my hands and feet hurt badly from the cold. We were growing children and needed more food than we got. Sometimes the meaner big girls made us little ones give them our tea-time bread or evening biscuit. One afternoon, when I had been at Lowood for 3 weeks, a visitor came to see us. As the man entered the schoolroom, all the teachers and pupils stood up. When I saw the visitor, I felt afraid. It was Mr. Brocklehurst, the man who had talked to Mrs. Reed and I at Gateshead. I had been afraid he would come. I remembered that Mrs. Reed had told him I was a terrible child. He had promised her to tell all the teachers about me. If he spoke to the teachers, they would think of me as a bad child forever. At first, Mr. Brocklehurst spoke very quietly to Miss Temple. I could hear him because I was in the front of the class.
Miss Temple,
He said,
I am told that you gave a lunch of bread and cheese to the girls recently. Why did you do that? It is not in the rules.
Well, sir, said Miss Temple, the breakfast was so badly cooked that the girls couldn't possibly eat it, and they were hungry.
Miss Temple, listen to me. You know that these girls must become strong, patient, and unselfish. If they do not have some little thing, do not give it to them. Tell them to be brave and suffer like Christ himself. Remember what the Bible says. Man does not live by bread alone, but by the word of God. When you put bread into these children's mouths, you feed their bodies, but you starve their souls.
Miss Temple said nothing. Her face was as cold and hard as marble. Mr. Brocklehurst was looking at us and almost jumped in surprise.
Who is that girl with red curly hair, Miss Temple?
That is Julia Severn, said Miss Temple quietly. Her hair curls naturally, you see.
Yes, Miss Temple, but it is God we obey, not nature. Miss Temple, that girl's hair must be cut off. I have said again and again that the girl's hair must be plain. I see other girls here with long hair. Yes, I shall send someone tomorrow to cut all the girls' hair.
Mr. Brocklehurst, began Miss Temple.
To please God, these girls must have short, straight hair and plain, simple clothes.
Just then, the door opened and 3 ladies came in. These ladies must not have known Mr. Brocklehurst's thoughts about clothes and hair. They all wore expensive dresses and had long, beautiful curly hair. I heard Miss Temple greet them as the wife and daughters of Mr. Brocklehurst. While Mr. Brocklehurst was talking, I hid my face behind my writing slate so that he would not see me. But suddenly the slate fell from my hand and broke in 2 on the hard floor. I knew what would happen next. Mr. Brocklehurst looked at me coldly.
Come here, child.
I was too frightened to move, but 2 big girls pushed me towards him. Miss Temple whispered to me, "Don't be afraid, Jane. I saw it was an accident." Her kindness made me feel better, but I knew that soon she would hear the lies about me, and then she would dislike me too.
Put the child on that chair,
said Mr. Brocklehurst. Someone lifted me up onto a high chair so that I was close to his nose. Frightened, I felt everyone's eyes on me.
You see this girl?
said Mr. Brocklehurst.
She is young. She looks like an ordinary child, but she is not. She is very wicked. Children, don't talk to her. Stay away from her. Teachers, watch her carefully. You must punish her body to save her soul, if she has a soul. This child, I can hardly say it. This child is a liar.
How terrible, said the two Brocklehurst daughters.
I learned this,
continued the man,
from Mrs. Reed, the kind lady who cared for her. In the end, Mrs. Reed was so afraid of this child's bad ways that she had to send her here. So, teachers, watch her carefully.
The Brocklehurst family stood up and moved slowly out of the schoolroom. At the door, the man turned and said,
She must stand half an hour longer on that chair, and nobody may speak to her for the rest of the day.
So there I was, standing on the chair. Feelings of shame and anger burned inside me, but just when I thought I would cry, Helen Burns walked past me and lifted her eyes to mine. Her look calmed me. What a smile she had! It was an intelligent, brave smile, lighting up her thin face and her tired eyes. At 5 o'clock, all the girls left the schoolroom. When I was sure no one could hear me, I climbed down from the chair and sat on the floor. I no longer felt strong or calm, and I began to cry bitterly. I had wanted so much to make friends and be happy at Lowood. Now, nobody would believe me, or perhaps even speak to me. Could I ever start a new life after this? Never, I cried to myself. I wish I were dead. Just then, Helen arrived, bringing my coffee and bread. I was too upset to eat or drink, but she sat with me and talked gently to me. She helped me to stop crying and feel a little better. When Miss Temple came to look for me, she found us sitting quietly together. Come up to my room, both of you, she said. We went to her warm, comfortable room upstairs. Now, tell me the truth, Jane, she said. You have been accused, and you must have the chance to defend yourself. And so I told her the whole story of my lonely childhood with the Reed family and of the terrible night in the Red Room. I know Dr. Lloyd, who saw you when you were ill, she said. I'll write to him and see if he agrees with what you say. If he does, I shall tell everyone in the school you are not a liar. I believe you, Jane. And she kissed me. Then she turned to Helen. How are you tonight, Helen? Have you coughed a lot today? Not very much, ma'am. And the pain in your chest? It's a little better, I think. Miss Temple examined Helen carefully and sighed a little. Then she gave us some tea and toast. For a while, I felt I was in heaven, eating and drinking in the warm, pretty room with kind Miss Temple and Helen. But when we reached our bedroom, Miss Scatcherd was checking the drawers. Burns, she said, yours is far too untidy. Tomorrow, all day, you will wear a sign on your forehead saying, untidy. Helen said Miss Scatcherd was quite right and wore the sign all the next day. But I was very angry, and at the end of the afternoon, I took it off her head and threw it in the fire. A few days later, Miss Temple received a letter from Dr. Lloyd. He wrote to her that what I had said was true, and she told the whole school that I was not a liar. Then I truly felt better. From then on, I studied as hard as I could and tried to make friends. Chapter 6. Life at Lowood continues. As spring came and the days grew warmer, life at Lowood no longer seemed so hard. We enjoyed walking and playing outside under a blue sky. But the warm weather also brought sickness to our area. By May, more than half the girls were seriously ill. Because of the poor food and bad living conditions, many girls died. There was fear and death inside the school, but outside the sun shone on the flowers and on the little streams of water flowing through the valleys. Fortunately, a few of the girls and I did not get sick. We enjoyed the beautiful summer weather with no lessons or rules to follow at all. Sadly, Helen Burns could not come outside with me because she had tuberculosis. When I learned how sick she was, I decided to visit her. I found her lying in bed, looking pale and weak. "You have come to say goodbye," she whispered, coughing. "You are just in time. I'm going soon." "Where, Helen? Are you going home?" I asked. "Yes, to my long home, my last home." "No, no, Helen." I was crying at the thought of losing her. "Jane, your feet are cold. Lie down with me and cover them with my blanket." I did so. "Don't worry about me, Jane. I am happy," she continued. "Please don't cry. If I die young, I won't suffer. I am going to heaven." "Is heaven a real place?" I asked. "Yes, Jane, I'm sure of it. Our souls go there when we die," she answered firmly. "Will I see you again, Helen, when I die?" "Yes, you will go to heaven too, Jane." I could not quite believe that heaven existed, and I held tightly to Helen. I did not want to let her go. I was afraid that she would die that minute. We kissed goodnight and fell asleep. In the morning, Miss Temple found me asleep with Helen Burns dead in my arms. She was buried in a pretty place near a church. Gradually, the sickness left Lowood. I soon discovered that often there were good sides to all the sad troubles in life. Because so many girls had died, other people learned of the terrible conditions at the school. Immediately, money was raised to build a new school in a better place, and many improvements were made. We had warm clothes, softer beds, and good food to eat. The best part was Mr. Brocklehurst left the school. So Lowood became a truly good place for a girl to get an education. I stayed for 8 years, and for the last 2 years I was a teacher. All that time I was happy, and my dear friend Miss Temple helped me greatly. But when Miss Temple married and moved away, I decided it was time to change my life too. I had been at Lowood for many years, and I wanted to find new activities. I decided to find a job as a governess. Soon I received an answer from a woman named Mrs. Fairfax. She wanted a governess for a little girl about 8 years old. The school gave me permission to go, so I accepted the job. Soon, I thought, I would have a new life. What would it be like? Part 3. A Young Woman at Thornfield. Chapter 7. Mr. Rochester. The house where I was to work was called Thornfield. It was a large house in the country. After a day's journey, I arrived at the house. Mrs. Fairfax, who came out to meet me, was a little old lady. She seemed happy to have someone to talk to. The house was dark and cold, with large rooms full of beautiful, expensive furniture. It was not a very comforting house, but I was excited to live there, working for kind Mrs. Fairfax. However, I soon discovered Mrs. Fairfax was not the house's owner, as I had thought. She was only a servant. Thornfield belonged to a man named Mr. Rochester, who was not at home when I arrived. My pupil was a girl named Adele, who was 7 or 8 years old. Mr. Rochester had taken Adele to live with him after her mother had died. She was French and could not speak English, but I had learned French at Lowood, so I could speak to Adele. She was a pretty, happy child who liked to play with dolls and toys. I taught her English and other subjects for 2 hours every day in the library. It was difficult to make her study because she had never had school lessons before. A little time passed, and Mr. Rochester still had not come home. One day I decided to ask Mrs. Fairfax some questions about him. I was very curious to know what kind of man he was, and Mrs. Fairfax was happy to talk. "Do people like him?" was my first question. "Oh, yes. He comes from a rich family that is very respected. They have lived here for many years," she said. "But do you like him? What kind of person is he?" "Well, I have always liked him. He is a fair and good man to his servants. He is a little strange, though. He has traveled to many countries and knows a lot of things. I think he is a very strange man," she said. "What do you mean, strange?" I asked, interested. "It's not easy to describe. I never know when he is serious or joking with me. He is very mysterious, and his life has been full of adventure and trouble. Although I know him well, I understand him only a little. But he is a good man and a good master." Mrs. Fairfax would not tell me anything more about Mr. Rochester. Instead, she asked me if I wanted to see the house. We went through many large and beautiful rooms filled with old paintings and furniture. When we reached the top floor, I saw a small passage with some small black doors on its walls. They were all locked. I wondered what was behind the doors. They seemed to be hiding something. As we turned to walk down the stairs, I heard a strange, frightening laugh coming from behind the wall. "Mrs. Fairfax, did you hear that laugh? Who is it?" I said. "It is probably a servant named Grace Poole," she said. "She always works in one of those rooms." I heard the laugh again. It did not sound like the laugh of a normal woman. It did not even sound human. "Grace!" called Mrs. Fairfax. One of the little black doors opened, and a woman appeared. She looked too ordinary to be a ghost. "Grace, there is too much noise," said Mrs. Fairfax. "Remember what you have been told." Grace said nothing. She only nodded her head and went back into the room. In the next few months, I sometimes went up to the top floor, where I could look out of the high windows and be alone with my thoughts. I was happy with my work, but I felt that something was missing from my life. I wanted interesting things to happen. I wanted more adventure. People are not always happy with a quiet life, and women need adventure, even if men do not believe it. One day in January, I had a free afternoon, and I decided to take a fast walk. I wanted to get some exercise and see more of the area. It was a sunny winter day, and I was enjoying the fresh air and blue sky. I stopped on the road and watched the sun go down in the trees behind the house. Suddenly, I heard a horse coming. As I watched, It slipped and fell on the icy ground, and the rider fell off. I ran to try to help the man, who was talking to himself angrily as he tried to stand up. "Are you hurt, sir? Can I help you?" I asked.
"No,"
he said. Clearly his leg hurt him, and he sat down quickly. "If you need help, sir, I can get someone from Thornfield Hall," I said.
"Thank you, but I don't need anyone. I haven't broken any bones,"
he replied. He was tall and strong-looking. He had a dark face and dark eyes, and was about 35. Although he was strange and angry-looking, somehow I wanted to help him. "Sir, I won't leave you alone on this road until I see that you can get on your horse again," I said. When I said this, the man looked at me for the first time. He studied my face for a moment.
"I think you should be at home yourself,"
he said.
"Do you live near here?"
"Yes, sir. I live in that house over there," I said.
"You live at Thornfield Hall?"
he asked, surprised. He pointed to the house. It was now evening, and all the lights in the windows were on. "Yes, sir," I replied.
"Let's see. You aren't a servant at Thornfield. I can tell because of your black dress. You must be—"
He stopped speaking, but seemed to want to know who I was, so I told him. "I am the governess."
"Ah, the governess. Of course, I had forgotten."
He tried to stand up, but his leg was still hurting him badly.
"Well, I don't want you to find help, but you could help me yourself if you like."
"Of course, sir," I said, and so he leaned his weight on my shoulder, and I helped him walk to his horse. In a moment, he had jumped on to the horse's back.
"Thank you. You should go home now. It's getting dark,"
he said as he rode away. I walked back to the house, happy with the interesting meeting. In my mind, I saw the man's dark, strong face. Even when I arrived back at Thornfield, I did not go into the house immediately. I knew I would only spend the evening quietly with old Mrs. Fairfax. Instead, I stayed outside, staring up at the moon and the stars, thinking about a different, more exciting life. When I went inside, the servants told me that Mr. Rochester had arrived, but that he had hurt his leg when his horse slipped on the ice. Chapter 8 Life with Mr. Rochester. Now that Mr. Rochester had returned, Thornfield Hall was very busy. Many people came to visit him and talk about business. Adele was too excited to study. That evening, we had tea with Mr. Rochester. Of course, this was the man I had helped, with his dark hair and skin. Although his eyes were firm, they had a little humor in them. His leg was supported on a chair. He did not speak to me when I came in. "Did you bring a gift for Miss Eyre, Uncle?" Adele asked him.
"A gift? Who wants a gift?"
he said.
"Did you want a gift, Miss Eyre? Do you like gifts?"
"I've never gotten a gift, sir," I answered. "Anyway, I have no right to expect a gift from you, because I haven't done anything to deserve one."
"Why, Miss Eyre, don't be so modest. I've been talking to Adele. She's not very clever, but you've taught her very well."
"Well then, sir, that is my gift. A teacher is happiest when her students do well." Mr. Rochester drank his tea without speaking. After tea, he asked me to come and sit with him, while Adele played with Mrs. Fairfax.
"Where did you live before you came here?"
he asked. I was at Lowood School for 8 years, sir.
8 years? I'm surprised you lasted so long in that terrible place. You know, there is something wonderful in your face. What about your parents?
They died when I was a baby, sir. I don't remember them.
And your other family? Where are they?
I have none.
Who told you to come here?
I put a message in the newspaper saying I was looking for work as a governess. Mrs. Fairfax asked me to come here and work, I said. Yes, said Mrs. Fairfax, and sir, I can't tell you how glad I am that she came. She's a wonderful teacher for Adele and a good friend to me.
Now, Mrs. Fairfax, don't say nice things about Miss Eyre,
said Mr. Rochester sternly.
I am sure that her magic made my horse fall down in the road yesterday.
Mrs. Fairfax looked as if she did not understand, but I saw a light of humor in Mr. Rochester's eyes.
Miss Eyre,
said Mr. Rochester,
how old were you when you first came to Lowood?
I was almost 10 years old, sir.
And you lived there 8 years? So you are now 18. When I first saw your face, I did not know how old you were. What did you learn at the school? Can you play the piano?
A little.
Play us a song on the piano, then. It is in the library.
I did as he asked. But after I had played for a few minutes, he said,
That's enough, Miss Eyre. You do not play very well, but you are better than some others. Now, bring me your drawings.
I got them from my room. He looked at them for a while and then pointed to 3.
These 3 drawings are interesting,
he said.
Where do your ideas come from? Who taught you how to draw wind and space and feelings? But now it's late, Miss Eyre, so put them away. Adele should go to bed now. Good night to you all.
It seemed that Mr. Rochester suddenly wanted to be alone. Later that evening, I had tea with Mrs. Fairfax in the kitchen. Mrs. Fairfax, you told me that Mr. Rochester was a little strange, I said. Well, what do you think, dear? I think he is a very strange man. I am not sure what I think of him. He may seem strange to you, but I know him very well, so I understand him a little. He has had family problems, you know. What do you mean? I asked. Well, he had an older brother who died 9 years ago. 9 years is a long time to be upset. Is he still unhappy because of this death? Well, you see, there were a lot of bad feelings and anger in this house. Just before their father died, he gave the older brother the house and almost all the money. Mr. Edward, that's Mr. Rochester, was angry and left his family. He traveled around the world, but when his older brother died, he got Thornfield. But he doesn't come and live here very often, and I am not surprised. Why should he stay away? I asked. Mrs. Fairfax said nothing for a moment. She looked as if she was remembering the past. Well, dear, perhaps he believes Thornfield Hall is a sad place. It was clear that Mrs. Fairfax did not want to tell me anything more. A few days later, Mr. Rochester asked to talk to me after dinner. We were in the library, and Adele was talking with Mrs. Fairfax. Rochester called me over. He whispered to me,
Adele and Mrs. Fairfax are busy, so now I can entertain myself.
Tonight, he did not look so firm or angry, and there was a softness and humor in his fine, dark eyes. He saw me looking at him.
Do you think I'm handsome, Miss Eyre?
He asked. If this had been another person, I think I would have taken time to think, and then said something polite. But somehow I knew that Mr. Rochester would know I was not telling the truth. So I answered at once, "No, sir."
Ah, you really are interesting. You are a quiet, serious person, but you are not afraid to say what you really think.
"Sir, I'm sorry," I said.
No, don't be sorry. All right, tell me. What is wrong with my appearance?
"Oh, Mr. Rochester, I didn't want to say unkind things about you,"
Well, now you can.
he said cheerfully.
Now, look at my head. Do you think I am intelligent?
"I think you are extremely intelligent, sir. Would it be rude to ask, are you also good?"
A knife in the back. Well, Miss Eyre, I wanted to be good when I was younger, but life has been hard, so I've become as hard and tough as an old tree. I only have a little goodness left inside.
He was looking at me very carefully, and I wondered if he was drunk.
Miss Eyre, you look as if you do not know what to say. I want conversation tonight. It's your turn to speak.
He was right. I did not know what to say.
I'm sorry if I'm rude, Miss Eyre, but I'm 20 years older and more experienced than you. Don't you think I can tell you when to speak?
"Well, no, sir. Not just because you're older than me, but if you had learned from your experiences and were very wise, maybe you could command me then," I said.
Well, Miss Eyre, I haven't learned anything, so I don't agree with you. But will you obey my orders anyway?
"Sir, not many masters ask if their servants want to obey them," I said, smiling.
Of course, I'd forgotten that I pay you money. So, will you agree because of the money?
"No, sir, not because of that. I will agree because I see that you care whether a servant of yours is comfortable or not."
You are honest and have feeling. There are not many girls like you. But perhaps I go too fast. Perhaps you have awful faults inside your head.
"And perhaps you have too," I thought. He seemed to know what I was thinking, because he said quickly,
Yes, you're right. I have plenty of faults. When I was young, I made terrible mistakes. And I have never made everything right again. I could have been a very different person. I might have been as good as you. I am not a bad man, but I have done wrong. Why am I telling you all this? Because you're the kind of person people can really talk to. You listen and can give them hope.
"Do you think so, sir?"
I do. You see, when my life was difficult, I became desperate and did some terrible things. Now all I can do is regret the past.
"Asking forgiveness might help you, sir."
How do you know this? A young girl like you. You have never been out in the world. You have no experience in life. But you are right. I will try to lead a better life.
I stood up. The conversation was becoming very serious and hard to understand. "I must put Adele to bed now, sir," I said.
Don't be afraid of me, Miss Eyre. I have already said that you are a very serious person. You don't laugh very much, perhaps because of your hard life at the Lowood school. But I know you have a strong mind, and in time you will learn to laugh and talk freely. You are like a bird in a cage. When you get out of the cage, you'll fly very high. Good night.
Chapter 9. Mr. Rochester's Secrets. After a little time at Thornfield, I knew that Mr. Rochester and I were becoming friends. He was beginning to trust and like me. Many times, when we walked in the garden or sat by a fire in the evening, he told me strange stories of his life and adventures. One day he said to me,
Jane, it is strange that I tell you my secrets, but I know you will never tell anyone else. I know also that my stories can't have a bad effect on you. Your mind and heart are too strong and good for that.
I felt proud and happy that Mr. Rochester trusted and liked me so much. I thought about him a lot of the time. I was aware of his faults, but I also saw his kindness and goodness to me. From then on, my happiest times at Thornfield Hall were when I was with him. I could not imagine a more wonderful friend. One night, I woke up and heard a soft noise. I thought that someone was standing outside my bedroom. I got out of bed and said, "Who is there?" Suddenly, I heard a strange cry. It sounded like the cry of an animal. Then I heard a door close loudly on the top floor, where Grace Poole stayed. Did she make the noise? I wondered. I opened the door and saw that the hall was full of smoke. The door of Mr. Rochester's room was open, and I saw the smoke was coming from there. Immediately, I forgot my own danger and ran into his room. He was sleeping in his bed, with fire and smoke all around him. Even the bed was on fire. "Mr. Rochester, wake up! Wake up!" I screamed, throwing water on the bed to put out the fire. Not until the fire was almost out did he wake up. He was surprised to see that he was wet.
Jane, what is going on? Is there a flood in this house?
He said. "No, sir," I answered. "There's been a fire."
Jane Eyre, is it you and your magic?
He asked.
Did you put a spell on me again? Did you want to drown me this time?
I did not answer this. "Sir, please get up. Someone has tried to kill you." I told him about the strange sounds I had heard outside my room and about the fire. He turned very pale and thought for a few moments. "Do you want to talk to Mrs. Fairfax or the other servants, sir?" I asked.
No, we shouldn't wake them. Wait here for a moment. I'm going up to the top floor. I'll be back soon.
I waited in his room for what seemed like a very long time. When he came back, he looked worried.
Jane, did you see anything when you opened your bedroom door?
He asked, looking carefully at me. "No, sir."
But you heard a strange laugh.
"Yes, I've heard it before. It was like a strange laugh I heard once. I think it is Grace Poole. She laughs like that."
Well, perhaps it was Grace Poole who started this fire. I must think about what to do. I'm glad you're the only person who knows about this. Don't tell anyone. Now, go back to your room.
"Good night then, sir," I said, walking towards the door.
What? Are you leaving me already?
He said. He looked surprised, although he had just told me to go. "You said I should go to my room, sir."
But not without a kind word or two first. Why, you've saved my life, Jane. I don't like to owe anyone anything, but with you it's different. I'm happy to owe you my life.
Suddenly he took both my hands in his.
When I first saw you, Jane, I knew that you would be good for me. I saw it in your eyes when I met you. I was right to like your smile and your face.
He spoke softly, and there was a strange light in his eyes. "I'm glad I was awake, sir," I said. I was trembling, and I knew I could not control my feelings much longer. I needed time to think, but he still held on to my hands, looking at me. Then I thought of a way to leave. "Sir, I think I hear the servants moving," I said.
"Well, leave me then,"
he said, and let go of my hands. I could not sleep for the rest of the night. My mind was full of strange ideas and deep emotions. I felt that I was falling in love with Mr. Rochester, even though he was mysterious sometimes. Chapter 10. A Conversation with Grace Poole. In the morning I wanted to see Mr. Rochester, but I could not find him. At first, I thought he had told his servants that the fire was an accident. When I passed his bedroom, I saw Grace Poole sitting in a chair and cleaning something. She did not look like someone who could kill another person, but I decided to talk to her. "Good morning, Grace," I said, coming into the room. "Tell me, what happened last night? Why was there a fire? All the servants are talking about it." "Good morning, Miss Eyre," she said. "Well, Master Edward was reading in bed and fell asleep. The candle must have fallen over. The candle put the sheets on fire, but he was able to put the fire out quickly with some water." "How strange," I said quietly. "Didn't anybody wake up and hear what was happening?" When I said this, Grace seemed to look at me more carefully. I noticed a strange look on her face, like fear. "Well, Mrs. Fairfax and you have rooms near Master Edward's. Mrs. Fairfax is a heavy sleeper, like most old people, and she didn't hear anything. But you're young, Miss Eyre. Did you hear a noise?" "Yes," I said. "I'm sure I heard a strange laugh." Grace did not look upset by my words. Instead, she went on cleaning the room calmly. "I don't think Master Edward would have laughed when his life was in danger, Miss Eyre. You must have been dreaming," she said. "No, I wasn't dreaming, Grace, and I know what Mr. Edward's laugh sounds like. It was someone else," I said very firmly. "Did you open the door? Did you see anyone in the hall?" she said. She looked angry and frightened, like a trapped animal. Suddenly, I realized that if Grace thought that I knew what she had done, she might try to hurt me. "No, I didn't open my door. I locked it," I answered, "and I will lock it every night from now on." "That's very wise, Miss Eyre. There might be a criminal around. You never know." I was amazed by her calmness, and I could not understand why Mr. Rochester had not taken her to the police or made her leave the house. Why had he asked me to keep the fire a secret? Mr. Rochester was strong and proud. Why did he not punish a servant for trying to hurt him? Perhaps Grace Poole knew a terrible secret from his past and had promised to tell everyone if he tried to hurt her. Was he in love with her? No, I thought. That's impossible. He could never love anyone as plain and strange as she is. But then, I'm not beautiful either, and sometimes I think he loves me. The things he said to me last night, the look on his face. And my cheeks were red as I thought of those moments. Now I was even more impatient to see Mr. Rochester, but he did not appear. When I was having tea with Mrs. Fairfax that afternoon, she said, "It's a good day for the master's journey." "Journey?" I cried. "Where did he go?" "He left after breakfast to visit a family in a big house about 16 miles away. This family has asked many people to stay there for a party that will last for a week. The ladies at these parties always like Mr. Rochester very much, so he may not come back for a while. Who are the ladies that will be at the party? I asked. There are 3 sisters who are very pretty young ladies, and their friends, Blanche and Mary Ingram. But Blanche is the most beautiful of them all. I saw her once when she came to a Christmas party at Thornfield, 6 or 7 years ago. What does she look like? She was 18 then, a lovely girl, with beautiful white and pink skin, long curling black hair, and large eyes which shone like black jewels. She looked like a queen. All the men loved her because of her beauty and her lovely voice. Mr. Rochester has a good voice also, did you know? When she and Mr. Rochester sang together, it is wonderful to listen to. I didn't know he could sing, I said. I felt very strange inside as I listened to Mrs. Fairfax speak. Oh, yes, it's true. Blanche can also play the piano. The Master Edward said she played extremely well. And this beautiful lady isn't married yet? No, because I don't think the Ingram family has much money. But don't you think some rich gentleman hasn't fallen in love with her? Mr. Rochester, for example. He has money, doesn't he? Oh, yes, he has money. But you see, Mr. Rochester is almost 40, and she's only 25. Well, women marry men older than they are every day, and 40 isn't old at all, I said. Suddenly, Adele ran into the room, so we talked of other things. That night in my room, I said some hard words to myself. Jane Eyre, I said to myself, you are a fool. Why would a fine, wealthy gentleman like Mr. Rochester love you, a poor, plain governess? Just look at yourself in the mirror. I decided that I would draw an honest picture of myself. Then I would draw one of Blanche Ingram, painting the most beautiful young woman I could imagine. Then, whenever I thought about Mr. Rochester, I could look at the 2 pictures and see the great difference between us. In this way, I would destroy my foolish dreams. Certainly, Mr. Rochester would want to marry a woman like Blanche Ingram. Chapter 11. A Great Party at Thornfield. It was 2 weeks before I heard anything about Mr. Rochester. All that time, I tried hard not to think about him. I told myself that I was Adele's teacher and nothing more. Finally, one day, Mrs. Fairfax told us that she had gotten a note from Mr. Rochester. He was planning a house party at Thornfield. He would return in 3 days and had asked a large number of ladies and gentlemen to stay at Thornfield for several days. We all worked hard, cooking many delicious dishes and cleaning all the rooms. The only person in the house who was not excited by the party was Grace Poole. She stayed in her room upstairs and came down once a day to get food and drink. None of the servants spoke to her, and she never spoke to anyone. However, once I heard 2 servants who I did not know talking together, and when I heard Grace's name, I listened to them. "Maggie, does Grace make a lot of money?" said one. "Oh, yes, Mildred. She earns 5 times more than you or me," Maggie said crossly. "But she's good at the work, I expect," said Mildred. "Ah, she understands what she has to do, and she's good at the work because she's so strange, that quiet little mouse," said Maggie. "And
you can be sure no one for miles would want to do her job, even for all that money. You're right. I wonder if Mr. Edward... Suddenly, they saw me and immediately stopped speaking so loudly. They turned around so I could not see their faces. "Does she know?" Mildred whispered. "No, and she isn't going to find out. Do you understand? Don't tell her anything." It was then that I knew there was a secret at Thornfield. At last, the day of the party came. Everything was ready for Mr. Rochester and his guests. As the people arrived, Adele and I watched from an upstairs window. We saw Mr. Rochester on his black horse, and with him rode a beautiful lady, her black curls flying in the wind. That must be Blanche Ingram, I thought. Soon, many ladies and gentlemen were walking through the house, talking and laughing. Adele loved parties and hoped that Mr. Rochester would ask her to meet the guests, but she and I both went to bed early. Mr. Rochester asked for me to bring Adele down the next evening. The next night, Adele and I were in the sitting room when the ladies came in after dinner. We were dressed in our best clothes. All the women were beautiful, but I was especially interested in Blanche Ingram. After the gentlemen had had their wine, they came into the sitting room and coffee and tea were served. Everyone was paying attention to Miss Ingram. She played the piano excellently and sang sweetly. Her shining eyes, black hair, and fine figure made every man in the room look at her. But I was looking at someone else. The last time I had seen him was on the night of the strange fire. That night he had held my hands, told me I had saved his life, and looked at me with love. But now he entered the room without even looking at me, and took a seat with the ladies. I had tried hard to forget about Mr. Rochester, but now that I saw him again, I could not hide my feelings from myself. I felt that there was something in our minds and hearts that connected us. Just then, I heard Blanche Ingram say to him, "Oh, Edward, you should have sent Adele away to school instead of getting her a teacher. I saw that young woman with her. She's not very pretty, is she? Adele should have a pretty teacher. It's silly, you know. These girls never teach children anything. Oh, but what a boring thing to talk about. Edward, will you sing with me?"
"Certainly,"
he answered. I did not want to hear any more. I left the room quietly and was in the hall when Mr. Rochester appeared.
"Come back, Jane. You're leaving too early,"
he said to me. "I'm sorry, sir. I'm very tired." He looked at me for a minute.
"Something is wrong. What is it? Tell me."
"Nothing. It's nothing, sir."
"But I see you're almost crying. I don't have time now to find out why. Well, tonight you may leave early, but I want to see you every evening. Good night, my—"
He stopped, looked away from me, and walked away quickly. I stood there thinking, why did Mr. Rochester want me to be at the party? The old house had never seen so much life and activity during the days of the party. Every day, Mr. Rochester and his guests rode horses and walked in the beautiful gardens. He and Miss Ingram were together every day. I watched them closely. The way they acted made me believe that Mr. Rochester would soon marry her. But I did not feel jealous, because I knew he did not love her. She had tried to make him love her, but he had not given her his heart. I saw Miss Ingram's faults very clearly. She was intelligent, but had no thoughts of her own. She was beautiful, but unkind. She could never be a loving wife and mother. Mr. Rochester knew all of these things, but he would marry her anyway. But I did not know why. One day, when Mr. Rochester was away, a stranger came to the house. His name was Mason, and he told us that he was an old friend of Mr. Rochester's. He had just returned from the islands of the West Indies, where Mr. Rochester had once lived. Chapter 12 The Gypsy. Soon after Mr. Mason had met the other guests, a servant came into the sitting room and told them that an old gypsy woman had also come. She was supposed to be a fortune-teller. All the ladies were very excited and wanted to ask her their fortunes. Miss Ingram was first, and spent 15 minutes with the old gypsy woman in the library. She came back looking angry. "This is ridiculous. How can you people believe in that sort of thing?" I wondered if the fortune-teller had told her something she did not like. Next, 3 young ladies went in together and came back amazed. "She's ugly, dirty, and old," they cried. "But she knows everything about us. Everything." Suddenly, the servant entered the room again.
"Excuse me, Miss Eyre,"
he said to me.
"The gypsy woman knows you are here. She will not leave the house until she sees you."
"All right," I said. I was curious to see the gypsy. She was sitting in the library, reading a little black book. Her black scarf covered most of her face, but when she lifted her head, I saw her dark eyes.
"So, young lady, you are here to learn your future,"
she said. "Well, I must warn you, I don't believe in your skill," I said.
"I thought so, but I'm very powerful, you know. Why don't you tremble?
"I'm not cold."
Why don't you turn pale?
"I'm not afraid."
Why don't you ask me to tell your fortune?
"I'm not a fool." The old woman laughed and started smoking a short black pipe.
"I can prove that you're cold and afraid and a fool,"
she said.
"Listen, you're cold because you're alone. You're afraid because you lack love. And you're a fool because love is standing right in front of you and you won't even try to fight for it."
I said nothing, only waited.
"If you really want it, happiness is waiting for you. Tell me, do you know the master of the house, Edward Rochester? What do you think of his relationship with Miss Blanche Ingram?"
They seem to like one another.
"Like one another? I'd say more than that. I think they'll get married. Clearly, they will be a very happy couple. But I did tell Miss Ingram something about the Rochester property that made her look a little angry. If Miss Ingram meets a richer man, I think Mr. Rochester might lose his beautiful bride."
"Madam, I came to hear about my future, not Mr. Rochester's," I snapped.
"All right, then. Let me see your face. I see that feelings are important to you, but that common sense is your main guide in life. You will never do anything wrong or dishonest to hurt people. I like that about you. Well, I must stop pretending now."
Was I dreaming? The old woman's voice had changed and become so familiar.
"Well, Jane, do you know me?"
asked the familiar voice. Mr. Rochester stepped out of his disguise. My face turned red. "Sir, you've been talking nonsense to make me talk nonsense. It's not very fair."
"Do you forgive me, Jane?"
"I shall try to, sir, But you should not have done it, I said. But I smiled a little.
Where are my guests, Jane?
I am sure they are discussing the fortune-teller. Oh, another man has come to see you today.
A stranger? I wasn't expecting anyone. Who can it be?
His name's Mason, sir, and he comes from the West Indies. Mr. Rochester's face went white. For a few minutes he did not speak. Finally I asked, "Are you ill, sir?"
Jane, help me,
he said. I helped him to sit down and then sat next to him. He held my hand tightly.
Jane, I wish you and I were far away from here, with none of these terrible troubles to make me suffer.
How can I help you, sir? Please, tell me what is wrong.
Jane, I promise I'll ask you if I need help, but I cannot tell you anything now. Get me a glass of wine, please.
I did what he asked. He looked less pale, but very stern. After a while he spoke.
Jane, if all those fine ladies and gentlemen out there came and called me terrible names, what would you do?
He asked. If I could, I'd make them leave the house.
Or if they only looked at me, and then said terrible things about me when I could not hear, and then left me alone in the house.
I wouldn't leave you. I'd stay with you and comfort you, sir.
And if it seemed like the whole world was against me, would you still stay with me?
Sir, if you deserved my friendship, I wouldn't care what other people thought.
Thank you, Jane. I would like to see Mr. Mason now.
After I found Mr. Mason and left the two men talking in the library, I went to bed, wondering about Mr. Rochester's strange, serious questions. Some time later, I heard him walking with Mr. Mason to his bedroom, and I was glad that Mr. Rochester sounded happier. Chapter 13. Mr. Mason is attacked. I woke up in the middle of the night to hear someone shouting. I jumped out of bed. It came from the top floor. What was happening? Then I heard the sounds of two people fighting.
Help! 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 Won't anyone help me?
Yelled a man's voice.
Rochester! Rochester, for God's sake!
All the ladies and gentlemen woke up and opened their doors. What's happening? Are there murderers in the house? Where's Rochester? They cried.
Here I am,
said Rochester, coming down the stairs.
It's all right. Don't be afraid, ladies. A servant has had a bad dream, that's all, and started shouting. There's nothing to worry about. Please go back to sleep.
These words seemed to calm everyone, so they went back to bed. But I knew that I had heard two people fighting. I dressed and waited in my room, in case Mr. Rochester needed me. Soon, Thornfield Hall was quiet again. Then I heard someone outside my door.
Are you awake, Jane?
Said Mr. Rochester. Yes, sir, and dressed.
Good. I need your help. Bring a clean cloth with you.
Quickly and quietly, we went up to the top floor. Mr. Rochester opened one of the small black doors.
Does the sight of blood frighten you?
He asked. I don't think so, I said. We walked into a large, dark room with curtains hung on the walls. On one of the walls, a curtain was pushed back. I saw a secret door that led into another room. From inside the room, I heard angry-sounding noises. They sounded like an animal's, but also like a human's.
Wait here,
said Mr. Rochester. Quickly, he went into the secret room. I heard loud, frightening laughter, and Mr. Rochester speaking in a soft voice. Grace Poole was in there, I thought. She must truly be crazy. Then Mr. Rochester came out, closing the secret door behind him. Suddenly, I noticed that Mr. Mason was sitting in a chair. He was covered in blood. Suddenly, he opened his eyes and looked at us.
"Am I going to die?"
he asked.
"No, of course not,"
answered Mr. Rochester.
"Now, Jane,"
he said, turning to me,
"I'll have to leave you alone with Mason while I find the doctor. Please care for him while I'm gone, but do not speak to him."
I nodded and nervously watched him leave the room. He locked the door when he left. So here I was, locked in a room with a wounded man and a crazy, violent murderer. Only on the other side of a small door. It was a long night. I had plenty of time to think about all the strange things that had happened. First, there was the fire in Mr. Rochester's room, and now another attack on a stranger. How was Mr. Mason involved? What was he doing on the top floor? Not many people at Thornfield went up there. Mr. Mason's bedroom was near mine. And, most of all, why was Mr. Rochester so frightened when I told him that Mr. Mason had come to Thornfield? At last, Rochester and the doctor arrived.
"This is strange,"
said the doctor.
"The skin on the shoulder has been bitten, but also cut with a knife. When Rochester took the knife from her, she bit me,"
Mason said weakly.
"Well, Mason, I told you never to see her alone, or something like this might happen,"
said Rochester.
"When you return to the West Indies, forget about her. She is not the same person you knew. You must think of her as dead. Now, doctor, is Mason going to be all right? When you leave here, you can take him home with you, and then in a few days he can leave England."
It was now early in the morning, and the birds were beginning to sing. But the house was still quiet. No one saw Mr. Mason leave with the doctor.
"Look after him, doctor,"
said Rochester.
"Goodbye, Richard."
I thought his voice sounded tired and sad.
"Edward, always take care of her. Treat her well." "I'll do my best, Richard. I always have,"
said Rochester. Then Mr. Mason left.
"But I wish all this would be over,"
he said to himself after he had gone. As we returned to the house, he said to me,
"Jane, were you frightened when I left you there with Mason?"
"I wasn't afraid of Mason, sir. I was afraid of Grace Poole."
"But I locked her in that room so no one would be hurt. I would never leave you in danger."
"Will she continue to live here, sir?" I asked.
"Yes, but don't think about her. She can't hurt you."
"Sir, I'm sure your life is in danger while she's at Thornfield."
"Don't worry, Jane. Mason is more dangerous to me. He could hurt me very badly."
"How, sir?" I asked.
"If he decided to talk about me, he could destroy my chance for happiness in life. Sit down with me in the garden, Jane. I want to ask you something."
The sky was blue and the birds were singing.
"Now, Jane, what if there was a man who made a terrible mistake, years ago in a foreign country? For many years he must live with this mistake. It seems he will always be unhappy and alone. Suddenly, he meets someone fresh, good and pure. Now, can he forget the terrible past and live the rest of his life with her in peace?"
It was a difficult question to answer. In the end, I said, "Sir, even if this woman was very good, another human can't give you peace. You must ask for God's help."
"But I think I've found the woman who can make me happy forever. It's—"
He paused. I thought my heart would stop. I was waiting for him to say,
"Blanche Ingram,"
Mr. Rochester said in a hard-sounding voice. His face looked much less happy than before. He would not look at me as he spoke.
You know that I love her, don't you, Jane? Don't you think she'll make me happy?
Chapter 14. I returned to Gateshead. The next day, I got a letter from Gateshead. There was much trouble and sadness there. My cousin, John Reed, had spent all his money and most of his mother's. He had been in prison most of his life. He owed many people money. A week before this, he had killed himself. When she heard this terrible news, Mrs. Reed became terribly ill because John was still her favorite child. Although she could hardly speak, she told my cousins, Eliza and Georgiana, that she had to see me. Why, I did not know. Of course, I did not want to go there, but I could not refuse to see Mrs. Reed when she might die. So I went to ask Mr. Rochester if I could travel to Gateshead for a short time.
What is it, Jane?
He asked when I saw him. We had left the guests and were sitting alone in the library. Well, sir, I would like to visit my aunt, who is ill, for a week or two.
Jane, I thought you had no family.
I have no family who loves or cares about me, sir. This woman is Mrs. Reed, my uncle's wife. She is dying and wants to see me. I can't say no to a dying woman.
Well, Jane, I see you are determined to go. Where does she live? And how long will you stay?
She lives at Gateshead, sir. It is 100 miles away. I'll come back as soon as I can.
You must promise me to stay only a week.
Mr. Rochester said. I wondered why he looked so worried. I can't promise you that, sir. I might have to stay longer, but I'll come back soon.
But you can't travel 100 miles all alone, can you?
My cousin sent a carriage for me, sir, so I can leave tomorrow. Mr. Rochester did not say anything for a moment.
Well, if you're going to go, you'll need some money. I haven't paid you yet. How much money have you got, Jane?
He asked, smiling at me. I showed him the few coins that I had, and he laughed. Then took out some money.
Here is £50,
he said. But, sir, that's too much. You only owe me £15 for my teaching, I cried.
You're right. Give me that money back. If you had £50, you might stay away for months. Here's £10. Is that enough?
But now you owe me £5, sir.
You'll have to come back and get it then,
he said, laughing. There's something else I want to talk to you about, sir, I said. This was not going to be easy for me to say. You have told me you're going to marry Miss Ingram soon, and that Adele should go away to school. So I must get ready to find another job somewhere. I will begin looking.
Don't do that,
he said.
Promise me, Jane, not to look for another job. I'll take care of everything.
I didn't understand him at all, but he looked so worried that I said, I promise, sir.
Good. And now I must go back to my guests. They are waiting for me.
Goodbye, Mr. Rochester, I said. The next day I traveled for many hours. As I traveled, I realized it had been 9 years since I had left Gateshead. In that time, I had become a different, stronger person. Most importantly, I did not hate the Reed family any more. I was happy to see my old friend Bessie again. She had married Robert the coachman and was always busy with her 3 young children. My cousins Eliza and Georgiana had disliked me almost as much as their brother John. They had not wanted me to come to Gateshead, so they pretended I was not there and never spoke to me. I did not really care. I told the housekeeper that I would stay for only a few days, and then I went to Mrs. Reed's room. I remembered the room from my childhood. Mrs. Reed was lying in the bed. I went to her and took her hand. "How are you, dear aunt?" I said gently. Many years ago, I had told Mrs. Reed that I would never call her aunt again. But seeing her so sick and alone, I felt sorry for her. "Are you Jane Eyre?" she asked. Her face was pale as death, but still cold and hard. That girl was so bad and troublesome. I was happy to send her away. And my poor, darling John, he needs so much money. What will happen?" I could see that her mind was ill, so I left her to sleep. During the next few days, Mrs. Reed got sicker. Every day I spent some time caring for her. The rest of the time I sat with Eliza and Georgiana, who had decided to speak to me. They wanted to tell me about their plans for the future. It was quite clear to me that they did not love their mother and wanted her to die so that they could leave Gateshead. One dark night, I visited the dying woman. She lay in her bed, sleeping. For a while, I stared out the window at the rain. I wondered about the great mystery of life and death. I remembered my friend Helen Burns, who had been dead for 9 years now. She had been so sure she would go to heaven. I wondered, would Mrs. Reed go there too? "Who are you, girl?" I heard the sick woman saying. "I have to see Jane Eyre. I must tell her something. The truth." "I am Jane Eyre, aunt," I told her gently. For a moment she looked into my eyes. "I know I am ill and old," she said in a weak voice. "Before I die, you must know something about yourself. I must tell you what I have done. Jane Eyre, there is a letter on my desk. Take it and read it." I found the letter quickly. It said,
Madeira, Dear Mrs. Reed, please tell me where I can find my niece, Miss Jane Eyre. I am not married and have no children, so Jane will receive all my money and property when I die. I would like her to come to see me in Madeira and perhaps live here. John Eyre.
I was so amazed that I could not speak for a few minutes. I had been poor all my life. Now, someone wanted to give me money and property. "Aunt, I never knew of this letter. Why?" Mrs. Reed tried to sit up in bed, looking at me angrily. "I wrote to your uncle and told him you had died of fever at the Lowood school." She laughed in a hard way. "That was my revenge on you, child. My family always hated your father for taking my sister away, and I always disliked you. You were always so angry and violent. Such a bad child. But now I am dying. I thought you should know the truth," she said. "I was not as bad a child as you think, aunt," I said gently. "It is true, I was angry at you, but I would have loved you, if you had let me. Forget it all, and kiss me now, dear aunt." But she had disliked me for too many years, or she was ashamed at what she had done. She turned away from me. After a moment I left the room. She died that night, and no one at Gateshead missed her. Chapter 15 The New Mrs. Rochester. And so I began to travel back to Thornfield Hall. While I was at Gateshead, Mrs. Fairfax had written to me. She told me that all the ladies and gentlemen had left, and that Mr. Rochester had gone to London to prepare for his wedding to Blanche Ingram. It was clear to me that he would be getting married very soon. After a long day of travelling, I decided to get out of the carriage at a little town near Thornfield and walk the rest of the way. It was a warm June evening, and I was glad to be out in the fresh air on my way home. Of course, I had to tell myself that Thornfield was not really my home. The person I most wanted to see loved another, and soon I must leave. And then, suddenly, I saw him. He was sitting near the gate ahead of me, writing in a notebook. He looked up and saw me.
"Hello!"
he cried, smiling. I was trembling at the sight of him, and I knew if I tried to speak, I would cry or say something ridiculous. So I only nodded my head and smiled.
"So it's Jane Eyre,"
he continued.
"It's just like you to walk outside in the fresh air instead of riding in a carriage. Tell me everything that you have been doing."
You know that I've been visiting my aunt, sir, who has just died.
"Jane, I think you must be a dream. You've been gone for a whole month. I was sure you had forgotten about me."
Even though I knew I would soon lose him, his words made me so happy that I couldn't walk away.
"Did Mrs. Fairfax tell you I've been to London?"
he asked. "Oh, yes, sir, she did."
"And she probably told you why I went there. Well, you must see the carriage I've bought her, Jane. My future wife will be riding in it. I wish I were more handsome, because she is so beautiful."
I said nothing, but thought, to someone who loves you, you are handsome enough. Sometimes it seemed to me that Mr. Rochester knew what I was thinking, but this time he only smiled at me and opened the gate.
"Come in, Jane, my dear friend,"
he said.
"and welcome home."
I walked past him. I was almost crying from his great kindness and friendship, but also because I knew I loved him. Something made me turn and say quickly, before I could stop myself, "Thank you, sir, for your kind words. I'm glad to come back to you, and wherever I am, I will always feel that where you are is my home, my only home." I ran across the field and into the house before he could answer me. 2 weeks passed, but I heard nothing more about the wedding. Blanche Ingram lived close to Thornfield, but I never saw her. I wondered when Mr. Rochester would marry her. It was the middle of summer, and every day the sun shone on the golden fields and the cool, green, dark forest. One evening, after Adele had gone to sleep, I went into the garden. I wanted to be alone, but then I saw that Mr. Rochester was already in the garden. I hoped that he would not see me as I walked quietly back to the house, but he turned around.
"Hello. No, don't run back into the house, Jane, on such a lovely night. Come and walk with me."
I could not say no, so I went to join him.
"Jane,"
he began,
"you like living at Thornfield, don't you? You like little Adele and Mrs. Fairfax, and I know they love you."
"I do like it here, sir. I really don't want to leave them."
"I am sorry,"
he said.
"These things happen in life. When you begin to like living in one place, then you have to leave it."
"Do I have to leave, sir? Leave Thornfield?"
"I'm afraid you must, Jane."
"Then you are going to be married, sir?"
"Yes, Jane. And, as you have told me, when Miss Ingram becomes my wife, you and Adele must leave the house." I am looking for a new job for you. Don't worry.
I don't want to cause you trouble, sir, I said quietly.
Oh, it isn't any trouble at all. In fact, I know about a very good job that is just right for you. You'll teach the 5 daughters of an Irish family. I think you'll like Ireland. It's a beautiful place.
He said happily. Sir, thank you for wanting to help me. But it's so far away, I said. I was trying not to cry. My heart felt as if it had been cut into pieces.
Far away from what, Jane?
From England, and from Thornfield, and...
Well?
From you, sir. I could not hide my feelings any more, and began to cry.
Yes, Ireland is very far away,
he said calmly.
Let's sit on this bench, Jane. You know, I sometimes feel as if you and I were connected. Our hearts and minds are the same in some wonderful way.
I wish I'd never been born, I cried. I wish I'd never come here. I said what was in my heart. Oh, I can't bear to leave. For the first time in my life, I've been so happy, and I've met you, Mr. Rochester, and I can't bear never to see you again. Now I have to leave. I feel as if I'm dying.
Why do you have to leave, Jane?
He asked innocently. Why? What do you mean, why? I cried, amazed. Because you're marrying Miss Ingram. She wouldn't want me here. She's your bride.
My bride? I have no bride,
he answered.
But I will have one, and you must stay.
I won't stay here. I won't, I shouted angrily, standing up. Do you think I can watch you marry another woman? Do you think I am a machine with no feelings? Do you think, sir, that because I'm small and poor and not pretty, that I have no soul and no heart? Well, you're wrong. I have as much soul and heart as you, or more, and I know my heart speaks to yours. We are equal.
We are,
said Mr. Rochester, taking me in his arms and kissing me.
Don't struggle, Jane, like a wild bird.
Let me go, Mr. Rochester. I am not a bird. I'm a free woman. Finally, he let me go.
Yes, Jane, you must make your own decision. I ask you to spend your life with me, to be with me always.
I could barely speak. I was both angry and terribly sad. Mr. Rochester, you're laughing at me. You've already chosen your companion for life. Mr. Rochester looked gently and seriously at me while I cried.
Jane,
he said,
I ask you to be my wife. You are my equal, Jane. I love you. Will you marry me? Don't you believe me?
No, I do not, sir, I answered.
I'll promise you. I don't love Blanche Ingram, and she doesn't love me. She only wanted to marry me for my money. But when she found out that I had only a little money, she forgot about me quickly. I love you. You strange, magical person. You small and poor and plain. I ask you to marry me.
You want to marry me? I cried. But I have no money, no family, and no friends in the world.
I don't care, Jane. Say yes, quickly. It's cruel to make me suffer like this. Give me your hand and say, Edward, I'll marry you.
He cried. His face was pale in the moonlight. Mr. Rochester, are you serious? Do you really love me? Do you honestly want me to be your wife? I asked seriously, looking at him.
I swear it.
Then, Edward, I will marry you.
My darling Jane.
He held me in his arms for a long time. I felt as if I was inside a dream. Once he whispered,
No family? That's good. No family to worry about.
And then?
I don't care what people think.
And again and again.
Are you happy, Jane?
I could not speak. I was so happy at the thought of being with him forever. The weather had changed while we had been talking. The sky grew dark, and the rain came down suddenly. We ran back to the house, holding hands and laughing. We were very wet when we arrived at Thornfield. We did not notice Mrs. Fairfax standing in a corner of the room, watching us.
Good night, my darling,
Mr. Rochester said, kissing me many times. As I ran upstairs, I suddenly saw the old lady. She looked shocked. Tomorrow I'll explain everything to her, I thought. At that moment, I was too happy to think about anything except my happiness. Mr. Rochester loved me. Outside, there was a terrible storm that lasted all night. In the morning, we saw that a large old tree in the garden, which had stood for hundreds of years, had been hit by lightning and torn in half. Chapter 16 The Wedding. Before I saw Mr. Rochester the next morning, I felt a little nervous. Was I really going to marry him, or was it all a dream? But I knew the answer when he came to meet me and kissed me.
Jane, you look well and smiling and pretty,
he said.
You will be Jane Rochester in 4 weeks' time. Not 1 day more. I don't want to wait any longer. I'll send for my family's jewels, which are kept in a London bank. These jewels are for the woman who will be my wife, whether she is a great lady or a poor teacher.
For me, sir, I cried. I'm too plain to wear jewels. I'm sure I wouldn't look very good wearing them. Mr. Rochester laughed.
I insist, Jane. Today I'm taking you to town to buy some beautiful clothes. In 1 month, we will have a small wedding at the church near Thornfield, and after a few days in London, we'll travel through all the countries of Europe.
Well, sir, you seem very happy to please me, but I wonder if you will do something else for me.
Ask me anything, Jane, anything.
Well, sir, I ask you not to give me jewels and fine clothes.
If that's really what you want, then I agree. But can't you think of anything I can give you?
Well, I'd like you to answer a question for me, I said softly. He looked worried and turned away from me for a moment. He said in a strange, quiet voice,
You may ask me something I cannot answer, Jane. What is it?
How stern you look. You will probably look that way when we are married. This is what I want to know. Why did you make me think you wanted to marry Miss Ingram? Immediately, he stopped looking worried and smiled at me, and smiled down at me.
Is that all you want to know? All right. I shall have to tell you. But you might be angry with me, Jane, just like last night. I pretended to love Miss Ingram to make you jealous. I wanted you to love me as much as I loved you.
But didn't you care about poor Miss Ingram's feelings?
She only has one feeling, pride. Were you jealous, Jane?
Never mind, Mr. Rochester. I have one more thing to ask you. Please explain everything to Mrs. Fairfax. She was so surprised last night when she saw us. I'm sure she doesn't know what to think. When I visited Mrs. Fairfax later that day, I knew she was amazed by the news that I was going to marry Mr. Rochester. When I saw her, she looked upset, but I did not understand why. Miss Eyre, I can't believe it, she said. You are a wonderful young lady, and any young man should be happy to marry you. But Mr. Rochester is a gentleman from one of the best families in this area, and he's 20 years older than you. What will people say? He could be your father." "Oh, certainly not, Mrs. Fairfax," I said. "He looks much younger than that." "Does he really love you?" she asked. Her question made me hurt and a little angry. I turned around to look at her. "Mrs. Fairfax, don't you think he could love me?" I said. "Oh, yes, Miss Eyre. I didn't mean to upset you. I only mean to say you must be careful of what people will say. I think you and Mr. Rochester should not see each other too much until you are married." Although Mrs. Fairfax's words did upset me, I thought perhaps she was right. So, in the weeks before the wedding, I did not let Mr. Rochester hold me or kiss me. We sat together in the library, but I was careful not to show him too much love. Sometimes he was angry with me and called me a hard little thing, but I knew he respected me for my actions. It was not easy, of course, because I really wanted to show him my love. At last, the night before our wedding arrived. I was ready to begin traveling, but I wanted very much to see Mr. Rochester, who had been away on business. I decided to go outside and meet him when he came. In the garden, I passed the large and broken old tree. Then suddenly, I saw him riding on his horse.
"Hello! You see, Jane,"
he shouted.
"you can't do without me. Jump up onto my horse and let's go home."
We rode back to Thornfield together. While he ate dinner, I sat quietly beside him, not talking. After a while, he looked closely at me.
"You look sad, Jane,"
he said.
"Is anything wrong? Are you worried about your new life?"
"No, Mr. Rochester," I said firmly. "I'm not worried about what my new life will be like. It will be wonderful because I love you. But last night I had a strange dream, a terrible dream. In my dream, there was a light in my room and a strange woman looking at my wedding dress. I was too frightened to move. It wasn't Mrs. Fairfax or any of the servants. Edward, it wasn't even Grace Poole. It was a horrible sight."
"Describe the woman, Jane."
"She was tall, with long dark hair. She put the beautiful veil you bought me on her own head. Then she looked at herself in the mirror. Then I saw her horrible face. She looked like a dead woman. She took off the veil, tore it in two, and threw it on the floor."
"And then?"
Mr. Rochester looked more frightened than I had ever seen anyone look. She came to my bed and put her candle close to my face so she could see me. She stared angrily at me for a long time. I must have fainted, and I think she left my room after that. Now, Edward, can you tell me who or what that woman was?"
"Jane, you are too upset. That was just a bad dream. Forget about it, darling,"
he said. "It wasn't a dream. It really happened. When I woke up this morning, I looked on the floor, and there was the torn veil." Mr. Rochester suddenly trembled.
"Oh, God, to think what she might have done,"
he cried, throwing his arms around me.
"Thank God you're not hurt."
After a few moments, he said calmly,
"Now, Jane, that woman in your room must have been Grace Poole. Nothing else could have happened."
"Maybe you're right," I said slowly, but I was not sure.
"Jane, one day I'll tell you why she lives here. I promise you. Tonight you should sleep in Adele's room. Nothing can hurt you there. Have happy dreams about our wedding."
Chapter 17 The Day of the Wedding. No friends or family went with Mr. Rochester and I to the church. I had not told my Reed cousins about my wedding because I knew they would not care. However, I had written to my uncle, Jane Eyre, in Madeira. Mr. Rochester was in such a hurry that I had only a few minutes to put on my wedding dress.
Jane, you look beautiful,
he said.
But you can only have 10 minutes for breakfast.
We went quickly to the church, Mr. Rochester's strong hand holding mine. His face looked worried and firm. He did not speak. I wondered why he did not look happy. The priest was waiting for us in the church. There was no one else there except for 2 men who stood by the door. Mr. Rochester did not seem to notice them, but I did. The wedding began, and soon I heard the priest ask a common question.
Is there any reason why these 2 people should not be married?
Suddenly, I heard a voice say clearly,
There is a reason. These people cannot be married.
The priest stared at the man who had spoken and said nothing. Mr. Rochester did not turn around, but only said,
Continue with the wedding.
The priest shook his head.
No, sir. I must let this man speak.
The man came forward and said, calmly and quietly,
They cannot be married, because Edward Rochester already has a wife.
I felt as if I had been hit. Mr. Rochester's face was like stone.
Who are you?
He said to the stranger.
And tell me why you think I am already married. I am a lawyer, sir. I have a paper here which says that 15 years ago you married Bertha Mason in the West Indies. That may prove I've been married.
Mr. Rochester said coldly and angrily.
But it doesn't prove that she's still alive. There is a man here who has seen her alive.
The lawyer stared at Mr. Rochester as if he hated him.
Show him to me, or go to hell,
said Mr. Rochester.
Mr. Mason,
called the lawyer. The second man came forward. His face was pale but firm. Mr. Rochester shouted,
Mason?
And raised his strong arm. For a second, I thought he was going to hit Mason.
Edward, no,
shouted Mason. Mr. Rochester dropped his arm and turned away from us.
Sir,
said the priest, frowning,
do not forget we are in the house of God. Now, Mr. Mason, please tell us what you know. His wife is alive, and she's living at Thornfield Hall,
said Mason in a strong voice. I cried out in shock. How could this be?
I'm her brother, and I've seen her there. She lives at Thornfield Hall?
said the priest.
I have lived here for years, and I never knew Edward Rochester had a wife. I was careful to keep her a secret,
said Mr. Rochester, frowning. Then he said,
I must tell the truth, I suppose. There will be no wedding today. God will punish me for this. These men are telling you the truth. I am married, and my wife is alive. I was tricked into marrying her when I was young, in the West Indies. There is much madness in her family, but they did not tell me that. Now it is too late. For many years, Bertha has been more like an animal than a human being. I keep her hidden in my house, and the servant, Grace Poole, watches her. Come to my house to see her, and decide whether I had the right to ask this innocent young woman to marry me. Follow me.
He held my hand tightly, without speaking, and we all left the church. At the door of Thornfield Hall, all the servants and Adele were waiting for us.
Too late,
cried Mr. Rochester.
Your congratulations are 15 years too late.
We went up to the top floor and entered the room where Mason had been attacked. As I watched, Mr. Rochester opened the secret door and showed us a little room inside. Grace Poole was making soup over a fire, and behind her a woman crawled on the floor. She growled like a wild animal, but wore clothes and had long, thick, dark hair. This was the woman I had seen, Mr. Rochester's wife.
"How are you, Mrs. Poole?"
said Mr. Rochester.
"And how is your patient today?"
"Not bad, sir," said Grace. "But be careful. She is upset, so don't let her see you." Suddenly, the woman turned and attacked Mr. Rochester. I recognized her face. It was pale, and I thought that once, long ago, it might have been pretty. With Grace Poole's help, Mr. Rochester was able to tie the woman to a chair. Then he turned to us with a bitter smile.
"You see, gentlemen, this is my wife. This is the partner I must live with forever. And instead, I wanted to have Jane Eyre, this young girl. Can you honestly blame me? Compare the two, and then tell me you think I'm wrong."
We all left the room silently. As we went downstairs, the lawyer said to me quietly,
"Miss Eyre, I know you did not know about Bertha Mason. None of this is your fault. It is Edward Rochester's terrible mistake. Mr. Mason will tell your uncle what happened when he returns to Madeira."
"Do you know my uncle?" I asked, surprised.
"I am John Eyre's lawyer, also. Your uncle and Mr. Mason know each other. On his way back to the West Indies, Mr. Mason stopped in Madeira and stayed with Mr. Eyre. He told Mason that you were going to marry a Mr. Rochester in England."
"Yes, I wrote to tell him I was getting married," I said.
"Well, when Mr. Mason told him that Mr. Rochester was already married, your uncle told him to return here immediately to stop you from marrying Rochester. I'm afraid your uncle is ill, and he may die soon. I think you should stay in England until he or I write you a letter."
After the men had left, I went to my room and locked the door. Slowly, I took off my wedding dress and veil. I was tired, and my head hurt as I began to think about what had happened. Could I ever trust Mr. Rochester again? Had he ever really loved me? My hopes were all dead, and my future was empty. I lay on my bed and wanted to die. Chapter 18. Mr. Rochester's Story. Sometime in the afternoon, I woke up from a long sleep. I felt weak when I stood up, because I had not eaten anything all day. When I opened my bedroom door, I saw Mr. Rochester. He was sitting in a chair outside my door. He looked at me with the face of an unhappy man.
"I've been waiting for you all this time, Jane,"
he said quietly.
"I've been listening. I haven't heard you shout or scream or cry, not once. Aren't you angry with me? But I never meant to hurt you. Can you ever forgive me?"
I knew he was telling me the truth. In my heart, I forgave him immediately.
"Shout at me, Jane. Tell me how terrible I am,"
he said. "Sir, I can't right now. I am tired and weak. I need some water." He took me in his arms and carried me to the library. He put me in front of the fire and gave me some water and a glass of wine. Slowly, my body began to feel better. Mr. Rochester bent to kiss me, but I turned my face away.
"What?"
he cried.
"You won't kiss me? It's because I'm married, isn't it?"
"Yes, sir."
"I know you very well, Jane. I know how firm and strong you are when you've decided to do something. You're planning to destroy my chances of happiness with you. You will treat me like a stranger. You will tell yourself, that man lied to me and tried to marry me when he couldn't. I must be cold to him, and you will be."
"It's true, sir. I said, trying to stop myself from crying. Everything around me has changed, and so I must change too. Adele must have a new teacher.
Oh, Adele will go to boarding school. I've already decided that. And you and I will both leave this house, this stone hell, this house of living death. We can never be happy here, under the same roof as Bertha Mason. Oh, how I hate her.
Sir, I cried, don't hate her. You can't. It's not her fault she is mad.
Jane, my darling, it's not because she's mad that I hate her. If you were mad, I wouldn't hate you. I'd take care of you lovingly. But why talk of this? We are ready to travel. Tomorrow we'll leave. I know a place where nobody will find us or talk about us.
And take Adele with you, sir. She will be your companion. I interrupted. I was shaking all over, but I knew I had to tell him soon.
Adele? What are you saying, Jane? Adele is going to school. I don't want her. I want you with me. Do you understand?
I did, but I slowly shook my head. He was becoming angry and was staring fiercely at me. He looked as though he was about to lose control. I was not afraid because I knew I could calm him. I took his hand in mine and said, "Sit down, sir. I'll talk or listen to you as long as you like." All this time I had been trying not to cry, but now I did. It was a great relief.
Don't cry, Jane. I can't stand it. Please be calm.
He cried. How can I be calm when you're so angry?
I'm not angry, but I love you so much, and your pale little face looked so stern and decided.
He tried to put his arm around me, but I would not let him.
Jane?
He said sadly.
You don't love me, then?
Edward, I do love you, I answered, more than ever, but this is the last time I can say it. I know now what I have to do, but you'll be so angry if I tell you.
Oh, tell me. If I'm angry, you can always start to cry,
he said, smiling a little. Mr. Rochester, I must leave you. I must live a new life with strangers.
Of course. I told you we would leave here. I'll ignore that silly talk about you leaving me. You'll be Mrs. Rochester, and I'll be your husband until I die. We'll live together happily in the south of France. Now, Jane, don't shake your head, or I'll get angry.
Sir, your wife is alive, I said firmly. If I lived with you, I'd be your mistress, and I can't do that.
Edward, you're a fool,
he said suddenly to himself.
Jane, I haven't told you the whole story. You must know everything. Listen to me, Jane. Do you know what happened to my family's money after my father died?
Mrs. Fairfax told me a little about it, sir.
Well, as you know, he decided to give my older brother everything. This meant I would be poor for the rest of my life, unless I married a girl who had money. Without asking me, my father decided that I should marry Bertha Mason. She was the daughter of my father's rich friend, Jonas Mason. I was young and foolish in those days. When I saw Bertha in the West Indies, she was beautiful. I thought I loved her and wanted to marry her. But after the wedding, I learned that Bertha's mother and younger brother were both mad. Bertha would probably become sick like them. Jane, my father knew all of this, but he did not tell me. Soon after our wedding, Bertha began to go mad. I lived with her in other places for 4 years. By now my father and brother were both dead, so I was rich. But I knew that I was really poor, because I was married to a mad woman for the rest of my life.
I pity you, sir. I do pity you, I said sadly. I could not imagine how terrible his life with Bertha Mason must have been.
Well, sometimes I wanted to shoot myself, But in the end, I decided to bring Bertha to live at Thornfield Hall. She has lived here ever since. No one in this house knows the whole truth about her, although Mrs. Fairfax knows she is here. But although I pay Grace Poole a lot of money to watch her, Bertha is still clever. She has escaped from her room at night, as you know. The first time she tried to kill me in a fire. The second time she visited you in your room. She must have wanted to know who you were. She must have remembered her own wedding day when she saw your dress.
And what did you do, sir, after you had brought her here?
I traveled all over Europe, Jane. I was looking for a good and wonderful woman to love.
But you couldn't marry, sir, I said.
I believed I could. I thought that one day I would find a woman who would understand my problem and accept me anyway.
Did you find one, sir?
No, Jane, but I spent 10 long years looking. I tried taking mistresses, but finally, unhappy and disappointed with my life, I returned to Thornfield on a cold winter day. And when my horse slipped and fell on the ice, you came and wanted to help me. In the next weeks, I began to depend on you, a quiet, bird-like young lady, for my happiness in life. I knew you were the only one for me.
Don't talk any more of the past, sir, I said sadly.
Jane, you're right. The future will be much happier. You understand now, don't you? I've spent so much of my life alone in misery. But now I've found you, and you are always in my heart. It was stupid of me to try and marry you without telling you my story. I promise to love you and stay with you forever. Jane, promise me the same.
When I said nothing, he said,
Why are you silent, Jane?
This was one of the most terrible moments of my life. I knew that he loved me and I loved him, but I knew I could not live with Mr. Rochester.
Jane, just promise me that you will be mine.
Mr. Rochester, I will not be yours, I said, shaking. He said nothing.
Jane,
he said, with a gentleness that cut into my soul.
Jane, do you want us to live apart forever?
Yes.
Oh, Jane, this is a terrible shock. It would not be wrong to love me.
It would be wrong to do what you want.
Jane, can you imagine my horrible life when you have left me? I will be alone, with no one but that mad woman upstairs. Where will I find friendship and love and hope?
Sir, you can only trust in God, live without doing wrong, and die hoping to go to heaven, I said. I had never said anything harder.
But all that is impossible without you. And you have no family that would be angry if you lived with me.
He sounded like a desperate man, and I knew what he said was true. But I also knew that I was right to leave him. He seemed to read my thoughts. He grabbed me and stared fiercely into my eyes. He could have broken me in two with one hand, but he could not break my spirit. I stared firmly back at him, even though I was small and weak.
Your eyes, Jane,
he said,
are the eyes of a bird. Even if I break your cage, I can't reach you, you beautiful girl. You'll fly away from me, but you could choose to fly to me.
He let me go and only looked at me. How hard it was to resist that look. I am going, Mr. Rochester, I said. My heart was breaking.
Does my love mean nothing to you? Oh, Jane, my hope, my love, my life.
And he threw himself into a chair. I had reached the door and was about to leave, but I could not. I walked back, bent over Mr. Rochester, and kissed his cheek. Goodbye, my dear Edward, I said. May God protect you.
Without your love, Jane, my life is nothing,
he cried, holding out his arms to me. but I turned and ran out of the room. That night I could not sleep because I was crying so hard. When I woke up, I took a few clothes and put a little money in a purse. As I went downstairs, I could hear Mr. Rochester in his room, walking around and around. I felt as if all my happiness in life was inside that room with him. I just had to enter and say, "I will love you and live with you forever." My hand moved towards the handle of the door. Almost I opened it, but I stopped myself and walked quietly out of the house. Walking on the road, I could not help thinking of how Mr. Rochester would feel when he saw that I had left him. I hated myself for hurting him, even though I knew what I was doing was right. I wanted desperately to be with him, to comfort him, but somehow I made myself keep walking. When a coach passed, I asked to travel on it until I had no more money. Inside the coach, I cried the most terrible tears of my life. I felt that I would never be happy again. Part 4. Life at Moor House. Chapter 19. Finding a Home. After traveling for 2 days, I arrived on the moor, a huge area with grass and many hills. After the coach left, I realized that I had left my clothes inside it, and that I had no money. I was alone on the open moor. There were many white roads that went across the moor. I walked until I found a dry place to sleep under a small hill. Luckily, it was a warm night with no rain. The next day was hot and sunny, and I needed food and water, so I knew I had to find a village. I walked down one of the roads until I found a group of houses. I knocked on the doors and asked if there was any work I could do, but no one could help me. I could not beg for food, although I was extremely hungry. That night I slept outside again, but this time the air was cold. The next day I looked for work again, but there was nothing for me to do. I was now very weak from hunger. I began to wonder why I should try to stay alive when I did not want to live. It was getting dark again, and I was alone on the moor. Suddenly, I saw a small light nearby. I guessed that the light meant there was a house, so I decided to try and find it. And finally, I arrived at the house. Standing by the door, I could see into a small window. An old woman and 2 young ladies were sitting by the fire. The room looked so bright and clean, and the women looked so kind, that I decided to ask for their help. The old woman opened the door, but she would not let me speak to the young ladies. She closed the door firmly, leaving me alone in the darkness and cold. I fell on to the wet doorstep, worn out and hopeless. No one would help me, and I was so miserable that I was ready to die. But the young lady's brother found me when he came home a few minutes later. He brought me into the house, where the ladies gave me a meal and asked my name. "Jane Elliot," I replied. I did not want anybody to know who I was, or where I had come from. Finally, they took me upstairs to a bedroom, and I fell into a warm, dry bed. For 3 days and nights I lay in bed, tired from the awful experience at Thornfield. I hardly knew where I was. When I began to feel stronger, Hannah, the old lady, came to sit with me and told me all about the 3 people in the house. She had cared for them since they were children. Their family name was Rivers, and both their parents were dead. Their father, sadly, had died only 3 weeks before this. The girls were named Diana and Mary. They had no money and had to work as governesses. Their brother, St. John, worked at the church in the nearest village. He was a Christian and very serious. The house I had found was called Moor House, and the Rivers family did not come here often. Diana and Mary were very kind to me when I became stronger. However, their brother, St. John, seemed very serious and not friendly. He was young and very handsome. I knew that Diana and Mary wanted to know all about me, but they did not want to ask questions that would hurt me, so we did not talk of the past. But St. John asked me many questions. I only told him a little about myself. I said that after going to Lowood School, I became a governess for a rich family. Then, an unfortunate event that was not my fault made me have to leave the house. That was all I would tell him. I offered to do any kind of work, such as teaching, sewing, or cleaning, so that I could make my own money. St. John was very glad that I wanted to work and promised to find me a job. Chapter 20. Getting to know the Rivers family. I stayed 1 month at Moor House. In that time, I came to love the little house and the wild, beautiful fields around it, just like Diana and Mary did. We read books together and talked about them. Diana began to teach me the German language, and I helped Mary with her drawing. We were very much alike, so we spent the days and nights very happily together. But St. John hardly ever spent time with us. He was usually visiting poor and sick people in a little village called Morton, near to our house. Even if the rain fell and the wind blew, he always went there. I did not think St. John was a happy person. Often, I would see him staring out the window with a sad look on his face. I knew that Diana and Mary were planning to leave Moor House soon to work as governesses. St. John and Hannah, the old lady, would go back to the churchman's house in Morton. I knew my time at Moor House was almost over. I asked St. John if he had found any work for me.
Yes,
he said.
But it is a job with little money, so you may not want it. I would like to open a girls' school in the town of Morton. I have a building for the school, and there is a small house for the teacher to live in. A lady named Miss Oliver has kindly paid for the house's furniture. Will you come to Morton and teach at the school? You would pay no money to live in the house, but you would receive £30 a year and no more.
I thought for a moment. This work was not as good as working for an important family, but at least I would be independent. Thank you, Mr. Rivers. I would be happy to teach in your school, I said.
But you do understand?
St. John asked, a little worried.
It will only be a village school. The girls in your school will be poor and uneducated. You'll be teaching reading, writing, counting, and sewing.
I understand, and I'll be happy to do it, I answered. He smiled. He seemed very pleased with me. And I'll open the school tomorrow, if you like, I added.
Very good,
he said.
But I don't think you'll stay at the Morton School for very long.
Why do you say that? I asked. I am happy to stay here, although I think you are not. He looked surprised.
You're right. I'd like to leave here, but How did you know that about me? No, I think you won't like living in Morton because you need people around you.
He said no more. When it was time for everyone to leave Moor House, Diana and Mary were sad. You see, Jane, Diana told me, St. John will leave England soon to travel in other countries and teach people about God. Mary and I won't see him for many years. Maybe we'll never see him again. He's a very determined and brave person. I know he's doing God's work, but it will break my heart to see him go. And she began to cry. Mary said sadly, We have lost our father. Now we'll lose our brother too. Just then, St. John came into the room with a letter.
Our Uncle John is dead,
he said. Diana and Mary did not look sad. St. John gave them the letter to read, but then they all looked at each other. Well, said Diana, I suppose we don't really need any more money anyway.
Yes,
said St. John.
But if we had that money, how different our lives would be.
He left the room. After a few moments, Diana looked at me. Jane, you are probably surprised that we are not sad because Uncle John has died. He was our mother's brother. Years ago, he and my father quarreled with each other. My father lost all his money, but my uncle became very rich. Uncle John did not marry and had no children. He had no other family except for us and one other person who we do not know. My father always hoped that Uncle John would help us when he died by giving us his money. But it seems that this other person has gotten everything. Of course, we didn't really expect anything. Uncle John disliked my father, so he probably did not want to help us. But Mary and I would have felt rich with only £1,000 each. And St. John would have been able to help so many poor people around the world. She said nothing else and soon left the room. The next day, the Rivers family returned to their work, and I moved to the school in Morton. Chapter 21 St. John's Secret. I had 20 village girls to teach. Some of them spoke in such a strong, country speech that I could barely understand them. Their words did not seem like the English language. Only 3 of the girls could read, and none could write. At the end of my first day, I knew there would be much hard work to do. But I told myself that I was lucky to have any kind of work. Besides, these are good girls, and they want to learn, just like I did when I was their age, I thought. Ever since I had left Thornfield, I had thought of Mr. Rochester every day and night. That evening, I stood at the door of my house, looking at the sunset and the quiet fields. I allowed myself to imagine again the life I could have had with Mr. Rochester. He would have loved me very much, for a while. He did love me, I thought. Nobody will ever love me like that again. But I knew that I would only have been his mistress, not his wife. One day he would have become tired of me. In time, I would be happier here as a school teacher. I would be alone, but at least I would be honest. But when he came to visit me, St. John Rivers found me crying. He asked me,
Are you sorry you took this job?
Oh, no, I said. I know I will enjoy it, and I'm so grateful to have a home and work to do. A few weeks ago, I had nothing.
But perhaps you are lonely,
he said. I'm not lonely yet, and I'm sure I'll be very busy with my work.
Well, I think you should work hard. Don't think about your past. A year ago, I was unhappy also. The quiet life in the country was boring to me, and I thought about changing my work. Suddenly, I realized that God had an answer for me. He was telling me to be a missionary. No work is greater than that. Since then, I have been happy, getting ready to leave England and traveling around the world serving God. But I do have one human problem. I have promised God I will overcome this problem in my life.
I was listening to him so closely that I did not hear the sounds of someone walking nearby. "Good evening, Mr. Rivers," said a sweet voice. St. John jumped up and then turned slowly to face the person. A girl dressed in white was standing there. When she took off her hat, we saw her beautiful face. St. John's face turned red, and he looked at the ground as he said,
It is a lovely evening, but isn't it late for you to be outside alone?
"Oh, Father told me there was a new girls' school, and I just had to see it. I wanted to meet the new teacher." "That must be you," she said to me, smiling. "Do you like your little house and the students?" I knew that this must be Miss Oliver, who had paid for the furniture in my house. "Oh, yes, Miss Oliver. I think I'll like teaching here, and the house is lovely, thank you," I said. "If you like, I'll come and help you teach sometimes. Oh, Mr. Rivers, I am so tired. I was visiting friends, and I was out dancing until 2 o'clock this morning. How fun!" St. John looked straight into Miss Oliver's laughing eyes. He looked as if his heart wanted to fly out of his cage, but he said nothing. Miss Oliver went on talking. "Please come and visit my father, Mr. Rivers. Why don't you ever come?" she asked.
I can't, Miss Rosamond. I am very busy with my work,"
he said softly. It seemed to me that he really wanted to visit her, however. "Well, I must go home then. Goodbye." She held out her hand. When he touched it, his own hand was trembling.
"Goodbye,"
he said. His face was red. When Miss Oliver walked away, she turned back to look at St. John 2 times. But he never turned around to look at her. When I saw St. John's unhappiness, I didn't think so much about my own problems. At least, I had loved and been loved by someone for a short time. Every day, I watched St. John and Miss Oliver together. St. John taught a Bible lesson at the school, and Miss Oliver always came to the school at that time wearing her prettiest dress. She would walk towards St. John, smiling sweetly at him. He would look at her as if he wanted to say,
"I love you, and I know you love me. I could marry you and be happy, but my heart is already promised to God."
But he never said anything, and she always went away. Each day she grew a little sadder. I knew he wanted her, but he would not disobey God. He believed he had to become a missionary, serving God alone for the rest of his life. Miss Oliver's father liked St. John and would be happy if St. John married his daughter. I decided to try to convince St. John to marry Miss Oliver. I thought St. John could help the poor with Miss Oliver's money in England. Instead of traveling so far away, into the east. My chance to talk to St. John came one November evening when he visited me at home. He saw a drawing I had done of Miss Oliver, and he could not stop looking at it. I could give this drawing to you if you would like it, I said gently.
She's so beautiful,
he said, still looking at it.
I would certainly like to have it.
She likes you, I am sure, I said bravely, and her father respects you. You should marry her.
It's very nice to hear you say these things,
he said. He was not upset by my words.
I will let myself think about her for 15 minutes.
And he put his watch on the table and sat down, closing his eyes.
Married to the lovely Rosamund Oliver. Let me just imagine it. My heart is full of happiness.
And there was silence for 15 minutes while he thought about her. Then he put the drawing back on the table, picking up his watch.
No,
he said, shaking his head.
I can't marry her. You see, Jane, although I love her, I know that Rosamund would not make a good wife for a missionary. She would not be happy in this work.
But you don't have to become a missionary, I said.
Yes, I do. It's the great work that God has chosen me to do. I will teach the Eastern people about the Christian religion, peace and freedom. This is what I live and die for.
But what about Miss Oliver? I asked. She may be so unhappy if you leave.
Jane, Miss Oliver will forget me in a month. I know this about her. She will marry someone who can make her much happier than I could.
St. John, you speak calmly, but I know you're hurting.
You're right,
he said.
But believe me, I will never marry her. I will only serve God.
As he picked up his hat before leaving, he looked at the drawing of Miss Oliver once more. Suddenly he stared at me, and then tore off a tiny piece of the drawing very quickly. With a "goodbye," he ran out of the house. I did not understand why he had done this. Chapter 22. I am no longer poor. After St. John left me, it began to snow. It snowed all night and the next day. In the evening, I was sitting by the fire and had just begun to read when I heard a knock at the door. St. John came inside the house, covered in snow. "Is something wrong?" I asked. "No one should be outside in this terrible weather."
There is nothing wrong,
he answered calmly.
I just came to talk to you. Besides, I'd like to hear the rest of your story.
He sat down. I had no idea what he meant. I wondered if this was connected to his strange actions with the piece of paper on my table. But he looked normal, and we talked of ordinary things for a while. However, he always seemed to be thinking of something else. Finally, he said,
Jane, when I arrived, I said I wanted to hear the rest of your story. But perhaps it's better if I tell you a story. I think you have heard it before. 20 years ago, a poor churchman and a rich man's daughter loved one another. She married him, and her family never spoke to her again. Sadly, less than 2 years later, they were both dead. I have seen their graves. Their baby daughter was taken to live with her aunt, Mrs. Reed of Gateshead. I don't know if the child was happy living with Mrs. Reed, but she stayed at Gateshead for almost 10 years, until she went to Lowood School. You went to Lowood School yourself. In fact, it seems her life was just like yours.
He said, looking at me closely.
This girl became a teacher at Lowood, as you did, and then became a governess in the house of a man named Mr. Rochester.
"St. John!" I cried. I could not stay quiet.
I can imagine how you feel,
he said, holding up his hand.
But wait until I'm done with the story. I don't know anything about this Mr. Rochester, but I do know that he wanted to marry this young girl. But during the wedding, she learned that he already had a wife, and his wife was mad. After this, the girl disappeared. Many people have tried to find her, but no one knows where she is. But she must be found. A lawyer named Briggs needs to talk to her about something very important.
Just tell her one thing, I said desperately. What about Mr. Rochester? Where is he? What is he doing? Is he well?
I don't know. Why don't you ask me the girl's name and why people are looking for her?
Did Mr. Briggs write to Mr. Rochester? I asked.
He did, but Rochester didn't write back. Instead, a woman named Mrs. Fairfax answered his letter.
I felt cold and miserable. Probably Mr. Rochester had left England to live an exciting life in Europe. He would look for a new woman to love.
You won't ask the girl's name, so I'll tell you,
said St. John.
I have it right here.
He took out a little piece of paper and showed it to me. The paper came from my drawing book and said, Jane Eyre, in my own writing. I had written my real name on Miss Oliver's drawing without thinking.
You see, Mr. Briggs spoke of a Jane Eyre, but I only knew a Jane Elliot,
said St. John.
Are you Jane Eyre?
Well, yes, I cried. But doesn't Mr. Briggs know anything at all about Mr. Rochester?
Briggs isn't interested in Mr. Rochester. He's interested in you. Don't you want to know why?
Well, what did he want? I asked, almost rudely.
He wanted to tell you that your uncle, John Eyre of Madeira, is dead. He has left you all his money, and you are now rich. That is all.
I sat down in a chair, my legs shaking. Rich! One moment I was poor. The next moment I was wealthy. I could not believe it. I was very sorry that my uncle was dead, because he was the only family I had left. However, I would never have to worry about money again. I was independent for life.
Wouldn't you like to know how much money you have, Jane Eyre?
Said St. John.
It's only a little bit, just £20,000, I think.
20,000 pounds! I thought I would faint from surprise. I had never heard St. John laugh before, but when he saw my face, he could not help it. Perhaps you've made a mistake, I cried nervously.
No, there's no mistake,
he said, smiling.
Now, I must go. Good night.
He was about to leave when I said suddenly, Wait! Stop! Why did Mr. Briggs write to you if he wanted to find me?
Oh, I'm a churchman.
He laughed.
I have ways of discovering interesting things.
Oh, St. John, I know that isn't the reason. Tell me the truth, I said.
Well, I'd rather not tell you just now, but I suppose you'll find out sooner or later. So I'll tell you a little something about myself. Did you know that my full name is St. John Eyre Rivers?
No, I didn't. But then what? And I stopped, as I had begun to make a connection. Could it be true? But St. John continued to talk.
You weren't told very much about your family, were you, Jane?
I shook my head.
My mother's last name was Eyre,
he said.
She had 2 brothers. One was a churchman who married a Miss Jane Reed of Gateshead. The other brother was John Eyre of Madeira. Mr. Briggs, Mr. Eyre's lawyer, wrote us a letter. The letter said that our uncle had died, but he had left all his money to his brother's daughter. Then Mr. Briggs wrote again later, saying that no one could find this girl, but I've found her."
He went towards the door, ready to leave. "Wait, I have to think," I said. "So this means that you, Diana, and Mary are my cousins."
"That's right,"
he said. All my life I had been alone. Now I had found family to love and be proud of for the rest of my life. These people who had saved my life were my cousins. This knowledge made me happier than any money ever could. "Oh, St. John, I'm glad! I'm so glad!" I cried, laughing. St. John smiled.
"You looked so worried and serious when I told you about the money, and now you're happy about something ordinary."
"No, you don't understand. This means everything to me. You see, you already have some family, but I had no one, and now I suddenly have 3 wonderful cousins." I walked quickly around the room. My head was full of wonderful ideas. I could now help the Rivers family by sharing the money with them. There were the 4 of us cousins. If we shared my money equally, there would be £5,000 for each of us. That was plenty of money. It was a fair answer to our money problems, and we would all be happy. If they did not want to, Diana and Mary would never have to work again. We would all be able to spend more time together at Moor House. Of course, when I told my cousins what I wanted to do, they did not agree at first. But they knew that I was serious about sharing the money. So finally, they agreed to each take £5,000. Mr. Briggs, the lawyer, gave the money to each of us. Chapter 23. My Past Returns. I promised St. John that I would teach at the Morton School until Christmas. Then he could find another teacher. On the last day of school, St. John came to see me as I said goodbye to my students. I was sad to see some of them go.
"Jane, your students have already learned so much, and you've only worked here for a few months. Just think how good it would be if you spent your life teaching."
"Oh, no, St. John," I said. "I don't think I could do it forever. But don't talk about school now. It's Christmas time." He looked serious.
"What are your plans?"
"For the next few days, Hannah and I are going to clean Moor House. We'll get everything ready for Christmas. Everything must be ready for Diana and Mary when they come home next week for a really wonderful time." St. John smiled.
"That's all right for now, but I hope, Jane, that you'll soon think seriously about ways to use your mind, body, and heart in the service of God."
"St. John, we are all so lucky to be together, and we have so many reasons to be happy this Christmas. Don't scold me," I said cheerfully. That week, Hannah and I worked hard, cooking and cleaning. It made us happy to see Diana and Mary's faces when they saw the beautiful house and warm fires and all the cakes and Christmas foods we had made. Diana, Mary, and I had a wonderful Christmas week. We took walks on the moors, read, and sang together. We were even happier to know that we were independent women now because of our new money. But St. John did not join us in our fun. He continued to study all the time and visited the sick and poor as he had always done. "St. John, are you still going to leave us and become a missionary?" Diana asked him one day, a little sadly.
"Nothing will change my plans,"
he told his sister.
"I will leave England in a few months."
"And Rosamond Oliver?" asked Mary gently.
"What about her?" She is going to marry a Mr. Granby. Her father tells me he is a very nice young man.
St. John's face was calm, and his mind was thinking about other things. With surprise, I realized he no longer loved Rosamond. Somehow, he had pushed her out of his heart. Soon, our lives at Moor House returned to normal once Christmas was over. We began to study the things that interested us again, such as languages and drawing. However, St. John began to spend more time with Diana, Mary, and I. Sometimes I thought he was watching me. One day, when I was alone, he said to me,
Jane, would you learn the Hindustani language with me? I'll need it for my work in India, and you can help me to learn it by studying with me. You don't need German anyway. You will be a good partner for me because you study harder than my sisters do.
It seemed important to him, so I began to study Hindustani. Diana and Mary were surprised that I had stopped learning German. St. John and I spent many hours together studying. I had to work very hard to satisfy him. When I was with him, I felt that I was losing the freedom to be myself, Jane Eyre, and do the things I liked. St. John always wanted me to be serious. Soon I never laughed or even smiled. However, St. John seemed to want to be with me all the time, and I discovered that it was not unpleasant. All this time, I had not forgotten Mr. Rochester. I knew I would love him for the rest of my life. I had written letters to Mr. Briggs and Mrs. Fairfax, asking about him, but there was no answer. Soon I lost hope and began to feel unhappy again. Diana said she thought I looked tired and should go to the ocean for a rest, but St. John thought I should study even more. He gave me more of the Hindustani language to practice. One day, St. John and I had stopped our studying and were walking outside. He said to me,
Jane, I'll be leaving for India in 6 weeks.
You're serving God, so I'm sure He will protect you, I said.
But it seems strange to me that my friends won't come with me. Only those who serve God will go to heaven. What do you say to that, Jane?
I don't know what to say, St. John. I think, I said.
Then I must speak for you.
He interrupted.
Jane, come with me to India and teach the Word of God.
Was this what God wanted me to do with my life? I felt afraid, thinking that I might not be able to say no to St. John. St. John, don't choose me, I cried. But I knew that St. John would not understand my feelings. If he thought God was telling him to do something, he always did it, no matter how bad it was.
God wants you to be a missionary's wife, my wife.
He continued.
Trust in Him, Jane. Marry me to please God.
St. John, I can't do that. I can't marry you and go to India. I'm not strong enough, I said desperately.
I know how hard you can work, Jane. You can help me with the Indian women and teach English to many students.
I thought for a while, walking next to him and saying nothing. I believed I could live in India with St. John because the work would be rewarding and interesting. Yes, I could do that. But I know he doesn't love me, and yet he still asks me to marry him. Why? I thought. After a while, I said, St. John, I will go with you to India, but as your cousin, not as your wife. He shook his head.
No, Jane. As my cousin, you could marry some other man any time and leave me. I need a wife who will obey me and stay with me until death.
Even though I did not want to go, I felt St. John's power over me already. I could go with you to India as a friend, but I can't give up my freedom by marrying you. I will always give my heart to God, but you don't want it, St. John. You don't love me, and I don't love you. I said to him gently.
I'll ask you again in a few days. Remember, it's not me you're saying no to, it's God. You are disobeying God.
I turned to face him. St. John Rivers, you must make sure that you're not confusing what God wants with what you want. Later, I could not believe I had said this to him. He was very angry with me, and for the next week he was as cold as ice to me. This hurt me very much. I was sorry I had hurt him. But I began to see that, if I were his wife, he would kill my spirit and not feel bad about it at all. When he asked me to marry him again, however, he was very gentle and kind. We were alone in the sitting room, and he spoke to me quietly in his deep voice.
Remember, Jane, God wants us to do what is right. He asks us to work for him, and the people who do will go to heaven. Please say you will marry me.
I admired and respected St. John, and suddenly I almost wanted to agree. He gently held my hand, and I knew that it would not be a bad life in India. Maybe God was telling me to go, and I truly wanted to do what was right. All right, St. John, I said softly, feeling that my heart was breaking. If God gives me a sign that he really wants me to marry you, I will agree.
God has answered my prayers,
said St. John. We stood together in the house, waiting for a sign from God. It was completely quiet in the house, and I could almost hear my heart beating. I was almost excited. Suddenly, I heard a distant voice cry,
Jane, Jane, Jane.
And nothing more. Where did it come from? It was Edward Rochester's voice, and it was full of pain and sadness. For a minute, the whole world stood still. Then I jumped to my feet. Edward, I'm coming to you, I cried. Wait for me. I ran into the garden, crying out, Where are you? But there was no answer. I broke away from St. John, who was following me. He asked me many questions, but I only said, I have received my sign from God, St. John, I said. I will never go to India with you. I told him to leave me, and he obeyed. In my room, I thanked God for the sign he had sent me. Then I fell asleep, knowing what I had to do next. Part 5. The Next Mrs. Rochester. Chapter 24. A Surprise at Thornfield. In the morning, I told Diana and Mary that I had to go on a journey, and that I would be gone for a few days. They did not know the reason for my trip, but they did not ask me questions. After a day and a half of traveling, I arrived at the village near Thornfield. I ran across the field, thinking that, in a few minutes, I would see the man I loved. He might be walking in the gardens, and I could surprise him, I thought. But when I reached the main gate, I had a horrible shock. Thornfield Hall was nothing but a burned mountain of stones. Everything was quiet. This was why no one at Thornfield had answered my letters. There had been a terrible fire. Is anyone hurt or dead? I cried out as I began to run back to the village. I had to find someone who could tell me what had happened. In the village, I stopped at a hotel and asked.
"Well, miss,"
The owner said,
"one of Mr. Rochester's old servants is a good friend of mine. They told me everything. I can tell you that it was that Bertha Mason who started the fire in the room that used to belong to the governess. You see, Rochester was in love with this girl, even though she was just a plain little lady. When she left, he almost went mad himself. His wife knew about the girl and was very jealous. When the fire began, Rochester put his life in danger, helping everyone leave the house. Then he bravely went back to save his wife, but she jumped out of a window and killed herself. But because he tried to save her, he was hurt badly in the fire. He lost one hand, and he is blind now. It's sad, isn't it, miss?"
Where is he now? I asked.
"Well, I think he lives at Ferndene Manor, which is another house of his. It's 30 miles away."
I found a carriage to take me there immediately. Chapter 25 Happiness. Ferndene Manor was a pretty old house in the forest. As I came near, the door of the house opened, and Edward Rochester came out. As I watched him, I felt both happy and sad. He looked as strong as before, and his hair was still black, but in his face I saw a bitter, desperate look that was not there before. The blind man walked slowly along the path. Many times he looked up hopefully at the sky, but it was clear that he could see nothing. After a while he stopped walking. Rain fell on his bent head. Finally, he walked slowly back to the house and closed the door. When I knocked at the door, Mr. Rochester's old servant, John, opened it. He knew me immediately, and I asked to stay at the house that night. "But he may not want to see you, Miss Eyre," said Mary, John's wife. We were talking together in the kitchen. "He won't see anyone except John and I." She was lighting some candles. "Mr. Rochester always wants candles in the sitting room, even though he's blind." "Give them to me, Mary," I said. "I'll take them to him." Mr. Rochester was sitting near the fire in the dark room.
"Put down the candles, Mary,"
he said. "Here they are, sir," I said.
"Wait. You are Mary, aren't you?"
he asked, listening carefully. "Mary's in the kitchen, sir," I answered.
"What wonderful dream is this?"
he cried suddenly.
"Where are you, speaker? I can't see, but I must know who you are, or my heart will stop. Let me touch you, or I can't live."
I held his hand in both of mine.
"Is it Jane? This is her shape."
He touched my arm, shoulder, neck, and waist, and held me close to him. "She is here," I said, crying with happiness, "and her heart, too. I am Jane Eyre. I found you and come back to you."
"My living darling! So you aren't dead. Is it a dream? I've dreamed so often of you, only to wake up in the morning alone, my life dark."
"I'm alive, and I'm not a dream. In fact, I'm an independent woman now. My uncle gave me £5,000 before he died."
"Ah, that sounds real. I couldn't dream that. But you must have many friends now, and don't want to live in an old house with a blind man like me."
"Sir, I can do what I like now, and I want to be wherever you are. I'll be your friend, your housekeeper, your neighbor. As long as I'm alive, you'll never be sad or lonely." For a moment he did not speak, and I did not know why. I had believed he would still want to marry me, and I wondered why he did not ask me.
"Jane,"
he said sadly,
"you cannot always be my nurse. It's kind and generous of you, but you're young and healthy, and one day you will want to marry. If I could only see, I'd try to make you love me again, but—"
And he sighed. But I knew he did not need to worry. Even if he was blind, I would always love him and stay with him. However, I decided to talk of other things and make him laugh a little. We talked for many hours that night. When it was time for bed, he asked me,
"Jane, there were only ladies in the house where you lived, weren't there?"
When I went to bed, I was still laughing. Good. A little jealousy will make him stronger and not so sorry for himself. The next day I took him for a long walk. I described the beautiful forest to him as we sat under a tree.
"Tell me, Jane, what happened to you after you left me?"
And so I told him my story. He wanted to know all about St. John, my cousin.
"This St. John, do you like him?"
He's a serious, religious man and a very good one. I do like him.
"He's perhaps an old man, about 50 years old."
St. John is only 29, sir.
"And very stupid, I think you said. Not at all intelligent."
I started laughing. He has an excellent brain, sir.
"Did you say he was rather plain, extremely ugly, in fact?"
St. John is a very handsome man, tall and fair, with blue eyes. Mr. Rochester frowned and swore loudly. In fact, sir, I continued, he asked me to marry him.
"Well, Jane, leave me and go. Marry Rivers. Oh, until now I was so happy."
Well, sir, he did ask me to marry him, in fact, but I will never do that. He doesn't love me, and I don't love him. He's a good man, but too cold. Don't be jealous, sir. All my love is yours. He kissed me.
"I'm no better than that old broken tree at Thornfield,"
he said.
"I can't expect to have a fresh young flower like you by my side all my life."
You are still strong, sir, and young plants need a tree's strength and safety to help them.
"Jane, will you marry me? A poor blind man with one hand, 20 years older than you?"
Yes, sir.
"My darling, we'll be married in 3 days' time, Jane. Thank God. You know, I never thought much of religion. Well, last Monday night, I was sitting by an open window, praying for peace and happiness in my dark life. In my heart and soul I wanted you. I cried out, 'Jane,' 3 times.
Last Monday night? Around midnight? I asked, amazed.
Yes, but this is the strange thing. I heard a voice calling, 'I'm coming to you. Wait for me.' And, 'Where are you?' Jane, it was your voice I heard. It was a sign from God."
I told him how I had spoken those words many miles away on that exact night.
"I thank God,"
said Edward Rochester,
"and ask him to help me live a better life in the future."
Together we returned to Ferndean Manor, Edward leaning on my shoulder. We had a quiet wedding. I wrote to tell my cousins the news. Diana and Mary were very happy for me, but St. John did not reply to the letter. Now it is 10 years later, and we are very happy. I am Edward's whole life, and he is mine. We are always together, and are never tired of each other. After 2 years, his sight began to return in one eye. Now he can see a little. When our first child was born, he could see that the boy had his large, dark eyes. Mrs. Fairfax no longer works, and Adele has grown into a charming young woman. Diana and Mary are both married, and we visit them once a year. St. John, of course, went to India to be a missionary. After a while, he forgave me for not marrying him. Now he writes to me often. He has decided that he will never marry. He knows that he will die someday soon, but he is not afraid of death. He will find a place in heaven.